Montana Territory, 1868. The land stretched vast and untamed beneath an endless sky, its beauty as merciless as it was magnificent. Rolling hills gave way to jagged mountains, their peaks disappearing into clouds that hung like spirits watching over the wilderness below. This was a place where dreams and nightmares walked hand in hand, where hope could turn to ashes with the changing wind. The Hollister wagon train carved a slow path through this majestic desolation, 28 souls bound together by shared dreams and the courage of the desperate. 28 souls save one destined never to reach their promised land. Among them was 11-year-old Catherine Sullivan Cat, to everyone who knew her, sitting cross-legged on the edge of the wagon bed, her feet dangling above the rutted trail. Her small fingers worked methodically in her lap, recording something in a leather-bound journal with meticulous care. Not words, but strange symbols that resembled musical notation of her own invention. "What are you writing now, Songbird?" Michael Sullivan asked, glancing back at his daughter from the driver's seat. He was a lean man with kind eyes and scholar's hands incongruous against the rough backdrop of frontier travel. "Listen," Kat said simply, tilting her head toward the forest that bordered their trail. "Three different birds. The wind through the pines makes the fourth voice. Together, they make a song." Michael smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling with affection and pride. A music teacher by training, he had recognized his daughter's extraordinary gift early, not just perfect pitch, but what he called nature's ear. Kat could hear the music in everything, rainfall crackling, fire, even the creaking wheels of their wagon. "Perhaps you'll teach that song to the children in our new home," he suggested. Hannah Sullivan emerged from beneath the wagon's canvas cover, her medical bag tucked under one arm. Though exhaustion shadowed her eyes, she'd been up most of the night tending to the Hollisters' youngest child, feverish with trail sickness. She managed a warm smile at the sight of her husband and daughter. "Our Cat will have the whole settlement monument singing within a month," she said, settling beside her daughter. "Just as she did back in Boston." Kat leaned against her mother's shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of herbs and clean linen. "Will they want to learn?" she asked, her voice suddenly smaller. "Mr. Hollister says the frontier folk don't have time for frivolities." Michael's expression hardened momentarily. "Music isn't a frivolity, Catherine. It's the language of the soul. It connects people across all divides, wealth station, even between different peoples. Remember what I've always taught you. Music is the universal language," Kat recited dutifully. "When words fail, music speaks." "Precisely. And that's why we're making this journey." Michael's gaze drifted to the horizon. "There's a need for understanding out here between settlers and the native peoples. Music might bridge what words cannot." Hannah squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "Your father believes music can help bring peace. It's a noble purpose, one worth traveling for." Kat nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. The journey had been long and difficult, their family joining the Hollister train late after Michael's position at the Boston Conservatory had been unexpectedly terminated, his views on teaching music to indigenous children deemed dangerously progressive by the board of directors. The wagon hit a deep rut, jolting them all. Hannah steadied herself, then glanced at the sinking sun. "We'll be making camp soon," she said. "Mr. Hollister mentioned a clearing by a stream just ahead. Why don't you gather some of those wild flowers you spotted earlier? I could use fresh materials for my medicines." Kat brightened immediately. "The purple ones with the star centers, I saw a whole patch just a little way back." "Don't wander far," Michael cautioned. "Stay within earshot of the wagons." Kat nodded, tucking her journal and pencil into the small satchel she always carried. Slipping down from the wagon, she fell back as the train continued forward, her eyes already scanning the trail edges for the medicinal flowers her mother had requested. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pines as Kat worked carefully, selecting the best specimens and recording their locations in her journal with quick sketches and notations about the sounds surrounding each patch. The different bird calls, the rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of the stream they would camp beside. In her mind, each place had its own song, a unique harmony she could recognize and remember. Time slipped away as it often did when Kat was absorbed in her observations. The sun dipped lower, the forest shadows lengthening into the first hints of dusk. Realizing how far she had wandered, Kat gathered her collection and turned back toward where the wagon train should have made camp. The first gunshot tore through the evening stillness like a thunderclap. Kat froze, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. And another shot followed, then another, the sounds multiplying into a terrible chorus punctuated by distant screams. Without conscious thought, she dropped to the ground, instinct driving her into the shelter of a massive fallen pine. The hollow beneath the upturned roots formed a natural hiding place, dark and close with the scent of earth and decay. Kat pressed herself into this space, drawing her knees to her chest, her breath coming in silent gasps as the shooting continued. Minutes stretched into an eternity of terror. The gunfire eventually slowed, then stopped, but the silence that followed carried something worse. Voices shouting commands, heavy footfalls. The occasional scream cut suddenly short. Kat remained motionless, paralyzed by fear as darkness gathered around her hiding place. Night had fully descended when she finally gathered the courage to peer out. The forest stood silent now, but an unnatural glow illuminated the trees from the direction of the camp. Flames, the wagons were burning. Moving with the instinctive stealth of prey, Kat crept toward the camp, staying low in the underbrush. The acrid scent of smoke grew stronger with each careful step, mingling with another smell, metallic and terrible, that some primal part of her recognized even before her conscious mind could name it. Blood. The sight that greeted her at the edge of the clearing would brand itself into her memory forever. The wagons had been arranged in their customary circle, but now they blazed like funeral pyres, casting macabre shadows across the bodies that lay where they had fallen. So many bodies, everyone she had known for the past 3 months of travel. The kindly Mrs. Hollister, who had shared her bread recipes. The Parker children, who had taught Kat to play jackstraws during rest days. All still and silent beneath the impassive Montana sky. Through a gap between burning wagons, Kat caught sight of movement men loading supplies onto horses, their faces half hidden by bandanas. They wore feathers and buckskin fringe, the traditional garb of native warriors. But as she watched from her concealed position, one of them removed his headband, wiping sweat from his brow. "Finish up," a commanding voice called out. "We need to be over the ridge before dawn." The voice carried a distinctive southern drawl, cultured but hard-edged. The speaker stepped into view, a tall man with a scar running along his jawline, clearly the leader. Unlike the others, he had already removed most of his native disguise, revealing the ordinary clothes of a frontiersman beneath. "What about the bodies, Mason?" one of the men asked. The leader, Mason, gestured dismissively toward the burning wagons. "Fire will take care of most. Any stragglers the scavengers will handle. Nobody's coming to look anyway. Official stories already set another Cheyenne raid on innocent settlers." He laughed, then a sound devoid of humor that sent ice through Kat's veins. "Territorial governor will have his excuse to push those savages off their land, and we'll have our payment. Everyone wins." "Except the dead," someone muttered. Mason's hand moved to his holster. "You developing a conscience, Jenkins, because I can cure that real quick." "No, sir, just making conversation." "Well, don't. Grab those medical supplies from the nurse's wagon. Good medicines fetch a fine price." Kat pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a whimper as she watched a man rummage through her family's wagon, tossing aside her mother's carefully organized supplies, pocketing the small bottles of precious medicines Hannah had brought from Boston. When the raiders finally mounted up and rode away their saddlebags heavy with plunder, Kat remained frozen in her hiding place, unable to move, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. Only when the last hoof beat faded did she find the courage to enter the ruined camp. She moved like a ghost among the dead, her mind detached from her body, as if observing someone else's nightmare. Near the remnants of the campfire lay Mr. Hollister, the wagon master, who had guided them for 3 months, his rifle still clutched in lifeless hands. The Parker family had fallen together, parents curled protectively around children, in death as in life. And then she found them. Michael Sullivan lay near their wagon, a hunting knife in his hand, his body surrounded by evidence that he had fought fiercely to protect what he loved. Hannah had fallen nearby, her medical bag spilled across the ground, its contents trampled into the dirt. They had died as they had lived, her father trying to create peace, her mother trying to heal. Something broke inside Kat, then a fundamental fracture in the foundation of her world. She opened her mouth to scream, to release the tidal wave of grief and horror that threatened to drown her, but no sound emerged. Her voice, the instrument she had used all her life to express joy and sorrow, to sing her father's songs and comfort her mother's patience, simply vanished. In its place came a terrible silence, as if the music of the world itself had been extinguished. The first days after the massacre passed in a fog of shock and primal survival instinct. Kat had gathered what she could from the ruined camp: her father's small flute, her mother's bag of medicinal herbs, a blanket only partially burned, a knife, a water skin. She had taken nothing from the dead, but memories too terrible to face yet impossible to abandon. Guided by some instinct she couldn't name, she had headed east into the mountains, away from the direction the raiders had taken, away from the trail that might bring other travelers. Each step carried her deeper into wilderness. Each night, spent huddled beneath whatever shelter she could find: fallen logs, rocky overhangs, the spreading branches of ancient pines. The weather had been merciful at first, early autumn warmth lingering like a last kindness before the coming winter. But as days stretched into weeks, the nights grew colder, the skies more threatening. Kat's meager supplies dwindled despite her careful rationing. The knowledge of wilderness survival that her father had enthusiastically shared during their journey: which berries were safe to eat, how to find water, which plants could serve as medicine, kept her alive, but just barely. It was the threat of the first snowfall that drove her to seek more permanent shelter. High in the mountains, she discovered a cave set into a cliff face its entrance, partially hidden by a stand of wind-twisted pines. Inside, the air was dry and still, the floor sandy with scattered stones. It wasn't home was gone forever, but it offered protection from the elements and predators alike. Here in this stone womb, Kat established the routines that would preserve not just her body, but what remained of her mind. Each morning she collected water from a small spring that emerged from the rocks nearby. She set snares for rabbits and squirrels, as her father had taught her, gathered what edible plants she could find, and stored them carefully for the coming winter. She reinforced her shelter with pine boughs, collected firewood, and created a small hearth near the cave's entrance, where smoke could escape through a natural chimney in the rock. And each night, by the light of her small fire, she wrote in her journal, not with words, for words seemed to have abandoned her along with her voice, but with her musical notations, recording the sounds of her days: the soft padding of a deer's hooves through fallen leaves, the mournful call of wolves from a distant ridge, the sharp crack of branches breaking beneath the weight of early snow. It was a language only she understood, but it preserved her connection to the world outside her grief. As long as she could hear the music in the wilderness, some part of her remained human, remained Kat Sullivan rather than merely a creature of instinct scraping survival from an indifferent land. But as autumn surrendered to winter's first assault, as snow began to blanket the mountainside in treacherous beauty, even this tenuous connection began to fray. The sounds diminished beneath winter's muffling embrace. The animals retreated into hibernation or migrated to lower elevations. The world grew quiet, and in that quiet, the silence inside Kat seemed to expand, consuming more of her with each passing day. She stopped attempting to form words even in her mind. Thought itself became less verbal, more a collection of impressions, instincts, and remembered sensations. She began to experience the world as the animals did, an alert to danger, attentive to opportunity present in each moment, because the past was too painful and the future too uncertain to contemplate. On a night when the full moon transformed the snow-covered landscape into an otherworldly terrain of silver and shadow, Kat emerged from her cave and stood upon a rocky outcropping that overlooked the valley below. The beauty was breathtaking, but she registered it only as information. Open spaces meant vulnerability. Moonlight meant visibility. Silence meant either safety or predators too skilled to be heard. From her satchel, she withdrew her father's flute. She hadn't played it since the massacre, partly from fear that the sound might attract attention, partly because each note carried memories too painful to face. But tonight, with the valley empty beneath a cold moon, with the nearest human settlement, days of travel away, the need for music finally overcame caution and grief. The first notes emerged tentatively, like a creature long caged testing freedom. A simple melody her father had taught her when she was barely old enough to hold the instrument, a lullaby his mother had sung to him in Ireland. The sound carried in the still air, echoing faintly from the surrounding peaks. As she played, something shifted inside Kat, a hairline crack in the wall of silence she had built around her heart. Tears gathered and spilled, freezing on her cheeks in the bitter cold, but she continued playing until the lullaby was complete. When the final note faded, she remained motionless, listening to the emptiness that followed. No response came from the sleeping forest, no acknowledgement from the indifferent stars. But something had changed nonetheless. She had made her mark upon the silence, asserted her humanity in the face of wilderness that would erase it. Returning to her cave, Kat took up her journal and wrote by firelight, not just recording the sounds of the day, but adding words for the first time since the massacre. Simple phrases, awkward after months of disuse, but words nonetheless. "I miss you, Mother and Father," she wrote. "I miss my voice. I'm afraid I'm forgetting how to be human." The admission once made opened a well of loneliness so profound it threatened to consume her entirely. Kat curled into herself beside the dying fire, clutching her journal to her chest like a talisman against the darkness, and surrendered to exhausted sleep. She couldn't know that her music had carried further than she imagined, that her moment of humanity had been witnessed by eyes more knowing than the stars, that her fate had already begun to intertwine with another's, drawn together by the simple, devastating power of a child's lullaby played in the wilderness. 6 months passed in solitary survival, 6 months of winter's brutality, giving way to spring's cautious renewal. Kat's existence had settled into patterns dictated by necessity rather than choice. Her cave had become a home of sorts, its walls adorned with simple markings that tracked the passage of days, its recesses organized with the few possessions she had managed to preserve or create. Her body had changed, adapting to its harsh circumstances. Once soft hands had grown calloused from gathering firewood and setting snares. Her frame, always slender, had become wiry with muscle and whittled by privation. Her movements had acquired the deliberate efficiency of a creature that couldn't afford wasted energy. But the most profound transformations were invisible. The civilized child from Boston, with her music lessons and books, her easy laughter and endless questions, had receded deep within, replaced by something wilder, more instinctual. She still recorded sounds in her journal, still occasionally played her father's flute on nights when loneliness became too heavy a burden, but these acts felt increasingly like rituals preserved from a forgotten religion, their meaning obscured by time and circumstance. Kat had not encountered another human being since the massacre. Part of her, the still rational, still human part, recognized that this isolation couldn't continue indefinitely. Eventually, she would need to seek out civilization, if only to replenish supplies she couldn't create herself. But the very thought filled her with paralyzing terror. Humans meant danger. Humans meant blood on moonlit ground, flames consuming everything she loved. Better the wolves whose territories she carefully avoided, the bears whose hibernation dens she gave wide berth. Their dangers were honest, uncomplicated by deceit or malice. Spring's arrival brought new challenges and opportunities. The melting snow created treacherous conditions on the steep mountainsides, but also revealed plants that had remained hidden through winter. Kat expanded her foraging range, carefully cataloging new growth that might serve as food or medicine. It was during one such expedition, on a day when sunshine had briefly triumphed over spring's capricious clouds, that Kat discovered a patch of early wildflowers growing in a sheltered hollow, the same star-centered purple blooms her mother had sent her to gather on that final fateful day. The sight stopped, her cold memories cascading through the carefully constructed barriers of her mind. Hannah Sullivan's gentle hands sorting stems and petals, the sound of her voice explaining each plant's properties, the scent of the herbal tea she brewed for the sick children on the wagon train. Kat knelt beside the flowers, her fingers hovering over their delicate blooms. After a moment's hesitation, she began to gather them methodically, just as her mother had taught her. These could be used to reduce fever, she remembered. Crushed and mixed with fat, they formed a salve for burns and rashes. So absorbed was she in this task, in this momentary reconnection with her lost mother, that she failed to register the subtle signs of another's presence, the unnatural stillness of birds, the faint displacement of air behind her. It was only when a soft, lilting melody drifted through the clearing that Kat froze her hands clutching the gathered flowers. A flute, its tone richer and deeper than her father's instrument, playing a hauntingly familiar tune, the very lullaby she had played beneath the winter moon. Slowly moving with the caution of prey-sensing predator, Kat turned toward the sound. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and imposing in the dappled forest light. His copper skin and long black hair marked him immediately as native, his clothing a mixture of traditional buckskins and more practical frontier garb. In his hands he held a wooden flute decorated with intricate carvings, its surface polished by years of use. But it was his eyes that captured Kat's attention. Dark, intelligent eyes that regarded her with neither surprise nor hostility, but with a calm assessment that suggested he had expected to find her here. Fear surged through Kat's body, a visceral wave that tensed her muscles for flight. Yet something held her in place, perhaps the music still hanging in the air between them, perhaps the absence of threat in the man's posture, or perhaps simply the shock of encountering another human after so many months of solitude. The man lowered his flute and spoke, his voice as deep and resonant as his instrument. "Little ghost child," he said in English, accented but clear. "I have been looking for you." Kat remained motionless, her mind racing through limited options. The cave was too far for her to reach before he could overtake her. The undergrowth offered concealment, but would slow her escape. The rocky slope to her right might provide defensible high ground, but the climb would expose her back to attack. As if reading her thoughts, the man slowly raised his empty hands, the flute now tucked into his belt. "I mean no harm," he said. "I have tracked you for many days. You hide well for one so young, but winter has been hard. You grow thinner, weaker." His words penetrated Kat's fear enough to kindle a spark of indignation. She had survived 6 months alone in wilderness that would have killed most grown men. Weak was not a word she would accept even in her diminished state. The man's expression softened slightly, perhaps detecting this flash of spirit. "My name is Swift Eagle. I am Cheyenne, a healer among my people." He gestured toward the flowers she still clutched. "Those you gather are good medicine. My grandmother called them fever stars." Kat remained silent not by choice, but by the same paralysis that had claimed her voice since the massacre. But her stance shifted subtly, wariness tempering slightly with curiosity. Swift Eagle studied her a moment longer, then slowly reached into a pouch at his waist. Kat tensed again, but what he withdrew was no weapon, only a small, familiar object that sent a jolt of recognition through her core. A wooden soldier, crudely carved but unmistakable in its details. A toy her father had made for the youngest Hollister boy during a rest day on the trail. "I found your people," Swift Eagle said quietly, "after the killing. I buried them with respect as I would my own kin." The world seemed to tilt beneath Kat's feet. Someone had found the massacre site, had tended to the dead she'd been forced to abandon, had known to look for survivors. Swift Eagle tucked the wooden soldier back into his pouch. "The men who attacked your wagon train, they were not Cheyenne, though they wore our dress. They were white men playing a dangerous game." His expression darkened. "The same men attacked my people's hunting camp 3 moons ago. Killed many, including my brother's family." He took a careful step forward, moving with deliberate slowness to avoid startling her. "I have tracked these men for many months, but I need to know what you saw, what you heard. Will you speak to me, little ghost child?" The question hung between them unanswerable. Kat opened her mouth, willing sound to emerge, but her throat constricted around emptiness. The silence that had been her companion for half a year would not be so easily banished. Frustration and shame flooded through her. Here finally was someone who might understand what had happened, who might help bring justice for her murdered family, and she couldn't even tell him what she had witnessed. Swift Eagle watched her struggle, his expression shifting from expectation to concern and finally to understanding. "Ah," he said softly, "the shock has taken your words." He tapped his temple. "But not your memories, I think. Not your knowledge." He considered for a moment, then slowly extended his hand, palm upward, not reaching for her, but offering connection. "Come, little one. Night approaches, and you are far from your shelter. I have a camp nearby with food and fire. We will find another way for you to tell your story." Kat hesitated, torn between ingrained caution and desperate loneliness. This man was a stranger, a member of a people she had been taught to fear, yet he had cared for her family's bodies, had sought her out not to harm, but to help. And he knew about the men who had destroyed everything she loved. Decision crystallized within her. Kat took a single step forward, then pointed deliberately at the wooden soldier in his pouch, then to herself. Swift Eagle nodded, understanding her gesture. "Yes, I will return it to you. It belongs with the living, not the dead." She pointed next to the flute at his belt, then mimed playing. A ghost of a smile touched his weathered features. "You heard my music and recognized your song. This is why I played it, to find the one who left such sorrow on the night wind." Kat nodded, a small but definitive movement. Then, still maintaining a cautious distance, she gestured for him to lead the way. As they walked through the gathering dusk, the Cheyenne healer and the silent child from Boston, neither could know the bonds their shared losses would forge, nor the dangers that still lay ahead. But for the first time in 6 months, Cat Sullivan was not entirely alone, and in that simple fact lay the first fragile seed of healing. Swift Eagle's camp occupied a small clearing beside a stream sheltered by ancient pines that broke the mountain winds. A simple lean-to of branches and hides provided shelter, while a stone-ringed fire pit held carefully banked coals. Everything was arranged with meticulous care wood, stacked by size cooking implements hung from a branch medicinal plants, drying on stretched rawhide. Kat absorbed these details with the heightened observation skills that had kept her alive, noting escape routes and potential weapons out of habit rather than immediate fear. The camp was well chosen, defensible, with clear sight lines to approaching dangers, yet hidden from casual discovery. Swift Eagle busied himself rekindling the fire, his movements efficient and practiced. "Sit," he invited, gesturing to a log positioned near the flames. "You must be hungry." Cat perched on the edge of the wall, ready to flee if necessary. Her hand remained close to the small knife concealed in her belt, though she doubted it would offer much protection against a grown warrior if his intentions proved false. The fire caught quickly, illuminating the clearing with warm, flickering light. Swift Eagle retrieved a pot hanging from a nearby branch and positioned it over the flames, adding water from a skin and a handful of dried ingredients. "Rabbit stew," he explained, noting her watchful gaze, "with roots and herbs that strengthen the body after winter's lean times." As the stew began to simmer, filling the air with savory aromas that made Cat's stomach clench with sudden sharp hunger, Swift Eagle settled on a stone opposite her. The fire between them offered both warmth and a symbolic barrier, close enough for conversation, distant enough for comfort. "You have survived alone through the hardest season," he observed, his dark eyes assessing but not unkind. "Few children of any people could do this. Few adults even. You have a strong spirit." The simple acknowledgement of what she had endured touched something deep within Cat. No one had witnessed her struggle, her daily fight against starvation and exposure and creeping despair. To have it recognized, respected even by this stranger, felt like water on parched soil. Swift Eagle reached into his pouch and withdrew the wooden soldier, placing it carefully on the log beside Cat. "As promised," he said, "I found this clutched in a small boy's hand." "Your brother?" Cat shook her head, then mimed rocking a baby, followed by holding her hand at knee height to indicate a young child. "Ah, a young one from another family." Swift Eagle nodded. "I buried 26 souls at that camp, all with proper ceremony to guide their spirits home." 26. The number struck Cat with physical force. Two fewer than should have been there. She held up 8 fingers, then 2, her expression questioning. Swift Eagle understood immediately. 28 in your party. Then 2 were taken or escaped besides yourself." He considered this new information. "The killers might have taken captives, or perhaps others fled as you did." Hope flickered briefly in Cat's chest, quickly tempered by realism. If others had escaped, they had not done so in her direction. And after 6 months of winter, any trail would be long cold. The stew had begun to bubble, its aroma increasingly enticing. Swift Eagle stirred it once, then turned his attention back to Cat. "I must know what you saw that day," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "But I understand words have left you, perhaps." He considered, then reached for his flute. "Music spoke between us before. Maybe it can speak again." He played a short, questioning melody, then looked at Cat expectantly. After a moment's hesitation, she withdrew her father's flute from her satchel. The instruments were different, her father's a simple European design, Swift Eagle's a traditional native flute with a distinctive warm tone, but music's basic language remained the same. Cat raised the flute to her lips and responded with a phrase that mirrored his question, but carried a darker undertone, minor notes suggesting grief and loss. Swift Eagle nodded, understanding. "Yes, we begin with sorrow, but perhaps we can find our way to something more." What followed was unlike any conversation Cat had experienced, a dialogue conducted entirely through music, with melodies standing in for words, rhythms for emotions, harmonies for shared understanding. Swift Eagle would play a phrase suggesting a question, and Cat would respond with the musical answers, sometimes clear and direct, sometimes hesitant and searching. Through this strange, beautiful exchange, Cat conveyed what she had witnessed, the attack's sudden violence. Her hiding place, the raiders revealing themselves to be white men in disguise, their leader's distinctive southern accent, their talk of payment and territorial politics. When their musical conversation finally ended, Swift Eagle sat in silence for several moments, absorbing all she had communicated. The stew had long since finished cooking, but neither had moved to eat, too absorbed in their unusual dialogue. "You have good ears," he said at last, "to remember voices and words so clearly. This will help us find these men." He leaned forward, his expression intensifying. "The leader, you heard, a tall man with a scar along his jaw." Kat nodded, emphatically surprised by his specific knowledge. "His name is Mason Wade." Swift Eagle said the name carrying a weight of personal history. "Once a soldier, now a killer for hire. He leads men who attack both settlers and native peoples, making each blame the other." He stirred the forgotten stew, then filled a wooden bowl and offered it to Kat. "Eat now, you need strength. There is much more to tell, and the night grows cold." Kat accepted the bowl gratefully, the rich aroma almost overwhelming after months of subsistence on whatever meager fare she could trap or gather. She ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, aware of Swift Eagle watching her with something like approval. When she had finished, he refilled her bowl without asking, then served himself. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire and nighttime forest sounds creating a peaceful backdrop to this unexpected shared meal. With hunger satisfied, Kat felt the day's exhaustion creeping over her months of vigilant solitude, making the presence of another human both comforting and disorienting. Swift Eagle seemed to sense her fatigue. "Sleep now," he said, indicating the lean-to. "I will watch through the night. You are safe here." Kat hesitated, ingrained caution warring with bone-deep weariness. Swift Eagle had proven himself trustworthy thus far, but surrendering to sleep in his presence required a leap of faith she wasn't certain she could make. Seeing her reluctance, Swift Eagle retrieved something from his pack, a necklace of wooden beads, some partially charred, as if recovered from fire. "This belonged to my brother's daughter," he said quietly. "Rising sun. She was your age when Wade's men attacked our camp. Like your people, they were killed for being in the wrong place at a time when powerful men needed them gone." He held the necklace out to Kat. "Among my people, we believe that when someone saves another's life, they become responsible for that life. I could not save Rising Sun. Perhaps that is why the spirits led me to you, the ghost child who plays sorrow to the moon." The simple sincerity in his words penetrated Kat's defenses more effectively than any elaborate assurances might have. She accepted the necklace, its weight solid and real in her palm. Without speaking, without needing to, she understood what he offered, not just protection for the night, but a shared purpose born of parallel grief. Kat tucked the necklace carefully into her satchel, then retrieved her journal. Opening to a blank page, she sketched quickly 2 figures, one small and one tall, standing beside a fire. Above them, she drew 2 transparent shapes, suggesting spirits or memories watching over them. She showed the drawing to Swift Eagle, who studied it with solemn attention before nodding his understanding. "Yes," he said softly, "they watch us, and perhaps they guide us toward justice." Exhaustion finally overcoming caution, Kat retreated to the lean-to, wrapping herself in the offered blanket. Its unfamiliar scent, smoke and herbs, and something uniquely human should have heightened her wariness. Instead, it provided an unexpected comfort, a reminder that she was no longer entirely alone in a vast, indifferent wilderness. As sleep claimed her, Kat was vaguely aware of Swift Eagle settling by the fire, his profile silhouetted against the flames, a patient guardian between her and the dangerous world beyond. For the first time in 6 months, Catherine Sullivan slept without fear. Morning arrived with golden light filtering through pine boughs, illuminating the lean-to's interior with a warm glow that momentarily disoriented Kat. The unfamiliar softness beneath her, a proper bedroll, rather than her usual nest of gathered pine needles and salvaged fabric, triggered a brief surge of panic before memory reasserted itself. Swift Eagle, the wooden soldier, their musical conversation by firelight. She sat up cautiously, listening for signs of his presence. The camp was quiet but not silent. A pot bubbled softly over carefully maintained coals, and from somewhere nearby came the rhythmic sound of wood being cut or shaped. Emerging from the lean-to, Kat found the clearing empty but clearly occupied. The fire had been tended, a breakfast of some sort simmered in the hanging pot, and her father's flute had been placed carefully on the log where she had sat the night before. Not a thread of her belongings had been disturbed. Following the sounds of work, she discovered Swift Eagle at the edge of the clearing, kneeling beside a fallen pine. His hands moved skillfully over a length of wood, shaping it with a small knife into what appeared to be a snare trigger. He looked up at her approach, his expression warming slightly. "Good morning, little ghost. You slept deeply. Dreams came easy." Kat nodded, somewhat surprised to realize it was true. No nightmares had disturbed her rest, no phantom gunshots had jolted her awake, as they so often did in her solitary cave. "Good, your body heals." Swift Eagle set aside his work and rose, moving with the fluid grace of a man completely at home in his surroundings. "Come, eat, and we will speak of what comes next." As they shared a breakfast of cornmeal porridge sweetened with wild honey, a luxury Kat had almost forgotten existed, Swift Eagle studied her with thoughtful consideration. "I have not asked your name," he said finally. "In my thoughts, you have been the ghost child for so long." Kat hesitated, then reached for a stick and carefully wrote in the dirt, "Cat." "Cat." Swift Eagle repeated the single syllable, accented differently in his mouth, but recognizable. "Short for something longer, I think." She nodded and added beneath it, "Catherine Sullivan." "Catherine." He pronounced it carefully, respectfully. "A good name. Strong." He tapped his chest. "I am Swift Eagle in your tongue. Among my people I am known as he who heals with songs." He gestured toward her throat. "Your voice did it leave when your family was taken?" Kat nodded, one hand rising unconsciously to her throat, as if she might physically locate the absence there. "I have seen this before," Swift Eagle said. "After great shocks, sometimes the spirit withdraws the voice to protect itself from screaming that might never end." His expression was compassionate, but not pitying. "It may return when your spirit feels safe again. Or it may not. Either way, you have found other ways to speak." There was something profoundly comforting in his matter-of-fact acceptance. Not false reassurance that her voice would certainly return, not awkward sympathy for its loss, but simple acknowledgement of reality and respect for her adaptation to it. Swift Eagle set aside his empty bowl and leaned forward, his manner shifting from conversational to purposeful. "Now, Catherine, we must speak of difficult things, of why I sought you and what must happen next." He withdrew from his shirt a folded piece of paper, weathered and creased from much handling. Unfolding it carefully, he passed it to Kat. It was a wanted poster, its ink faded but still legible. The crude illustration depicted a hard-faced man with a distinctive scar along his jawline, unmistakably the leader Kat had seen after the massacre. Beneath the image was printed, "Mason Wade wanted for murder. Theft, insurrection, 500 of reward. Dead or alive. This man leads those who killed your family," Swift Eagle said as Kat stared at the poster. "Once a soldier, now a killer who works for corrupt officials. He and his men dress as Cheyenne to attack settlers, then as settlers or soldiers to attack Cheyenne. They create hatred between our peoples while stealing land and gold for their masters." Kat traced the outline of Wade's face, her finger trembling slightly. Here was the architect of her nightmares, rendered in ink and paper, suddenly more real and yet more distant than the shadowy figure who had haunted her memories. "2 moons ago," Swift Eagle continued, "I discovered that Wade and his men camp in an abandoned mining settlement 3 valleys west of here. They keep stolen goods there between raids. They plan new attacks." His voice hardened. "They believe all witnesses to their killings are dead or silent." He reclaimed the poster, folding it carefully before tucking it away. "But they are wrong. You saw them, Catherine. You heard their words, their plans. Your ears remembered what others would forget." Swift Eagle's gaze met hers, directly intense, but not demanding. "I need your help to stop them, to bring justice for your family, for my brother's family, for all who have died in their false war." The request hung between them, momentous in its implications. Kat stared into the dying embers of their breakfast fire, her mind racing with conflicting impulses. Part of her, the wounded animal she had become during her months of solitude, wanted nothing more than to retreat to her cave, to disappear more completely into the wilderness where human concerns could not touch her. But another part, the Catherine Sullivan, who had existed before the massacre, the daughter of Michael and Hannah, who had believed in music's power to connect rather than divide, recognized the truth in Swift Eagle's words. These men would continue killing, continue turning settlers and natives against each other unless someone stopped them. And who but she and Swift Eagle could do it? Who else had seen the truth and lived to tell of it? Kat reached for her satchel and withdrew her journal, opening to the pages where she had drawn the faces of the raiders from memory. She showed these to Swift Eagle, whose eyes widened slightly at the detailed portraits. "You have a gift for seeing," he said, studying the drawings. "These are the men who were with Wade." Kat nodded, then turned to a page where she had recorded something else, not faces, but words rendered in her unique musical notation. She pointed to these marks, then to her ear, trying to convey that she had recorded the exact sounds of Wade's voice, his distinctive southern drawl, that she could recognize again, if heard. Swift Eagle's expression shifted from interest to something approaching revelation. "You can identify his voice even among many others," Kat nodded emphatically. During her months of solitude, sounds had become her primary connection to the world. She had developed what her father would have called perfect auditory memory, the ability to recall and recognize sounds with exceptional precision. "This changes much," Swift Eagle said, a new intensity in his voice. "I had hoped for your testimony, your witness. But this is something more valuable." He considered for a moment. "If we can get you close enough to hear Wade without being seen." The implications were clear. Kat could confirm Wade's identity beyond doubt, linking him directly to both massacres through the evidence of her own ears. But doing so would require leaving the relative safety of the wilderness, venturing back into the world of men and their violence. The very thought sent a tremor of fear through her, but Kat forced herself to consider it rationally. 6 months of hiding had changed nothing. Her family remained unmourned by any but herself, their killers unpunished and free to murder others. Decision crystallized within her. Kat closed her journal and nodded once firmly, her expression resolute despite the fear that churned beneath it. Swift Eagle recognized the courage this simple gesture required. "Your father and mother would be proud," he said quietly. "To face fear for the sake of justice is the act of a warrior." He rose and began methodically organizing the camp, preparing for departure. "We will not go directly to Wade's camp," he explained as he worked. "First, I must teach you to move as Cheyenne moves, silently and visibly, to listen as we listen, to survive not just alone, but among enemies." Kat watched him, noting the precise efficiency of his movements, the way he seemed to blend with his surroundings even in the simple act of packing supplies. There was much she could learn from this man who had tracked her for days without her knowledge, who had survived the same wilderness that had nearly claimed her. As Swift Eagle extinguished the fire, erasing all evidence of their presence with practiced care, he glanced at Kat with an expression that mingled determination with something gentler, perhaps understanding, perhaps respect. "The path ahead is dangerous," he acknowledged, "but you are not alone on it anymore, Catherine Sullivan. Two who were broken may yet become strong together." In that moment, beneath the vast Montana sky, a silent child from Boston and a Cheyenne healer united by parallel grief embarked on an unlikely alliance, one that would challenge everything Kat had been taught to believe about natives and settlers, about strength and vulnerability, about survival, and what makes it worthwhile. Neither could know the dangers that awaited them, nor how their quest for justice would uncover conspiracies far beyond a simple bandit's greed. But as they departed the clearing, moving like shadows through the awakening forest, both carried something they had lacked the day before: hope. In the days that followed, Kat's education began in earnest. Swift Eagle proved a patient but demanding teacher, imparting survival skills far beyond what she had managed to develop on her own. He taught her to walk without snapping twigs or rustling leaves, to identify game trails, too subtle for untrained eyes, to use terrain for concealment, while maintaining awareness of her surroundings. "You listen well," he observed on their third day together, after Kat successfully identified a mountain lion's presence by the sudden silence of birds long before the creature came into view. "But you must learn to listen with more than ears. The body has many ways of hearing danger." He demonstrated what he meant: how the skin could sense changes in air currents that signaled movement nearby, how certain scents carried warnings, how the spine itself seemed to tingle in response to watchful eyes. These were instincts Kat had begun to develop during her solitary months, but Swift Eagle refined them, providing context and technique where she had only blind intuition. In return, Kat shared her own methods of survival, the snares she had designed for smaller game, the techniques she had developed for preserving berries through winter, the system of notches she used to track days and lunar cycles. Swift Eagle acknowledged these contributions with the same respect he showed his own knowledge, incorporating some into their daily routines. They traveled slowly westward, maintaining a cautious distance from established trails, while gradually working their way toward Wade's camp. Each night they established a temporary shelter, and each morning they erased all evidence of their presence before moving on. Swift Eagle insisted on constant vigilance, aware that Wade might have scouts patrolling the surrounding territory. Communication between them evolved beyond the simple methods of their first meeting. When privacy permitted, they continued their musical dialogues, flutes carrying complex exchanges of information and emotion. But for times when silence was necessary, Swift Eagle began teaching Cat the hand language of the Plains tribes, a sophisticated system of gestures that allowed hunters to communicate silently across distances. Cat absorbed this new language eagerly, her expressive hands finding freedom in movements where her voice could not. Soon they could conduct entire conversations through gesture alone, a silent discourse that suited their furtive progress through potentially hostile territory. It was during one such exchange, as they prepared an evening meal in a sheltered ravine, that Swift Eagle revealed more of his own history. "I was not always a healer," his hands explained movements precise in the firelight. "Once I was a scout for the Blue Coat soldiers." Cat's surprise must have shown in her expression, for Swift Eagle nodded, a hint of old bitterness crossing his features. "Yes, I believed then that helping soldiers understand our lands might lead to peace. I learned their tongue, their ways. I translated between chiefs and commanders." His hands stilled momentarily. "I was wrong. Most soldiers did not seek understanding. They sought surrender movement, reservations, access to our hunting grounds." He continued preparing their meal, hands busy with practical tasks, but his expression remained distant, lost in memories. "One soldier was different," he eventually continued, gestures more measured now. "Captain Curtis Blackwood seemed to truly wish for peace. He spoke with respect to our elders, learned some of our language, shared meals in our lodges. Together we helped create a treaty that would allow both peoples to live side by side." Swift Eagle's jaw tightened, the only outward sign of the emotion this recollection stirred. "Then gold was discovered in our sacred mountains." Suddenly Blackwood changed. The treaty was forgotten. He spoke of progress and civilization that could not be stopped for superstitious attachments to land. Cat watched his hands form these foreign concepts, understanding dawning. This wasn't merely about random violence or simple theft. There were larger forces at work, powerful interests that viewed both settlers and natives as expendable pieces in a greater game of acquisition and control. When I protested, reminded him of his promises, Blackwood had me removed from my position, sent back to my people in disgrace. Swift Eagle's gestures became sharper, reflecting old anger. "Months later, Wade and his men attacked our hunting camp. My brother, his wife, their daughter, rising son, all killed. Many others too." He met Cat's gaze directly. "I was wounded but survived. Before I lost consciousness, I heard the attackers speaking to each other, not in Cheyenne, but in English. One called another by name. 'Wade.'" Cat nodded her understanding, then raised her own hands to ask a question that had been forming since their first meeting. How had Swift Eagle known to look for her specifically? "After recovering from my wounds, I tracked Wade's men to learn their plans. I discovered they had attacked a wagon train, claiming it was retribution by Cheyenne for military actions." His hands moved more slowly now, ensuring she followed his explanation. "I found the massacre site buried your people, but the count was wrong, 26 bodies, when wagon trains typically hold 30 or more." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "Then during winter's deepest cold, I heard music while hunting in these mountains. A child's song played on a white man's flute, filled with such sorrow it could only come from one who had witnessed great loss. I began searching for the player, finding small signs, snare marks, gathered berries, occasional footprints too small for an adult." Swift Eagle's hands completed the story with elegant efficiency. "I realized a child had survived the massacre, a witness who might help bring Wade to justice. So I continued searching until I heard your music again on the night of the full moon." Cat absorbed this information, pieces falling into place. She hadn't been as invisible as she'd believed during her months of solitude. Swift Eagle had been aware of her presence for some time, patiently tracking her movements, waiting for the right moment to make contact. She raised her hands to ask another question. Why had he played her father's lullaby that day in the clearing? A ghost of a smile touched Swift Eagle's weathered features. To let you know you were not alone, that someone else remembered the song, and by remembering, remembered those who taught it. The simple kindness of this gesture, reaching across the divide of fear and suspicion with music's universal language, struck Kat with unexpected force. Tears gathered in her eyes for the first time since that night beneath the winter moon. Swift Eagle allowed her this moment of vulnerability without comment or judgment, continuing their meal preparations with dignified discretion. When Kat had composed herself, he served her a portion of the rabbit stew they had prepared, then settled opposite her with his own bowl. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire and night sounds of the forest providing sufficient backdrop to their thoughts. Only when they had finished did Swift Eagle resume their conversation, this time speaking aloud rather than with gestures. "Tomorrow we reach more dangerous territory," he said, his deep voice pitched low to avoid carrying beyond their small camp. "We will be closer to Wade's men who sometimes hunt these woods. You must stay close to me. Follow my lead exactly. If we are separated," he held her gaze to emphasize the importance of these instructions, "you must make your way to the lightning-struck pine on the ridge we saw today. Wait there hidden until moonrise. I will find you." Kat nodded her understanding, though the prospect of separation sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest. Despite her months of self-reliance, she had grown accustomed to Swift Eagle's steady presence with alarming speed. The thought of returning to complete solitude, even temporarily, filled her with unexpected dread. Reading her concern, Swift Eagle reached into his pouch and withdrew a small object, a whistle carved from bone, its surface decorated with intricate symbols. "Take this," he said, offering it to her. "If you face danger and I am not there, blow once sharply. The sound carries far in these mountains, further than you might expect." "I will come." Kat accepted the whistle, its weight surprisingly substantial for its size. She tucked it carefully into her own pouch, recognizing it as both practical tool and symbolic connection, a thread between them should circumstances pull them apart. "Now rest." Swift Eagle advised, banking the fire for the night. "Dawn comes early, and we must move with first light." As Kat settled into her bedroll, pulling the blanket tight against the mountain night's chill, she found herself reflecting on the strange turn her life had taken. 6 months of solitary struggle had hardened her in ways she hadn't fully recognized until now, when Swift Eagle's presence highlighted what she had been missing, not just protection or practical knowledge, but human connection itself. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her father had brought their family west, believing music could bridge the divide between settlers and natives. Now his daughter, rendered mute by violence born of that very division, was finding her way back to humanity through an alliance with a Cheyenne healer who communicated through music and gesture. Michael Sullivan would have appreciated the poetry in that, she thought, as sleep began to claim her. Perhaps even found hope in it. Kat's last conscious awareness was of Swift Eagle settling into his customary position near the fire's embers, his profile silhouetted against the night sky, vigilant, patient, a guardian between her and a world that had already taken too much. Tomorrow would bring them closer to danger, closer to confronting the architect of both their sorrows. But for tonight, at least, there was shelter, companionship, and the small comfort of shared purpose. It would have to be enough. Dawn arrived with a heavy mist that clung to the mountainside, transforming familiar terrain into a ghostly landscape of half-seen shapes and muffled sounds. Kat woke to find Swift Eagle already alert, his posture conveying a new tension as he studied their surroundings. "The spirits hide us today," he observed quietly as Kat emerged from her bedroll. "But they also hide our enemies. We must move with extra caution." They broke camp swiftly, consuming a cold breakfast of dried meat and berries, while erasing all evidence of their presence. The routine had become familiar over the past days, but today it carried a heightened urgency that Kat felt in her bones. As they prepared to depart, Swift Eagle knelt before her, producing a small clay pot from his pack. Inside was a dark mixture that smelled of earth and pine. "War paint," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "Not for battle, but for hiding. White skin catches the eye in forest shadow." He demonstrated it on his own arm, showing how the mixture broke up the outline of his shape against the dappled background of trees. Kat nodded understanding, then held perfectly still as Swift Eagle applied the mixture to her face and exposed skin, his touch careful and impersonal as he worked. When he finished, he produced a small, polished stone that served as a mirror. Kat barely recognized herself. The face that looked back from the reflective surface seemed to belong to the forest itself, features blending into shadow, only her eyes remaining distinct, watchful and alert. "Good," Swift Eagle declared, satisfied with his work. "Now you was not a child of Boston, but a spirit of the mountain, a shadow among shadows." They set off into the mist, moving with deliberate stealth through the wet undergrowth. Their path took them gradually downward, leaving the high country that had been Cat's sanctuary for the lower slopes where human activity became more likely. The terrain changed subtly as they descended pine forest, giving way to more varied growth rock outcroppings, becoming less common, the gradient gentling from steep inclines to rolling hills. By midday, when they paused briefly in a sheltered hollow to rest and drink from a clear stream, Cat could sense the difference in the very air they breathed, heavier, warmer, carrying scents of earth and vegetation, rather than the crisp purity of the heights. Swift Eagle confirmed her impression, his hands forming words that couldn't risk being spoken aloud. "We approach the territories men claim. Here we are never alone." As if to punctuate his warning, the distant sound reached them, the crack of an axe against wood echoing through the trees. Cat froze instinctively, her body tensing for flight, but Swift Eagle placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Trappers or settlers," his gestures explained, "not our concern, but a reminder to remain alert." They continued their journey with even greater caution, Swift Eagle leading them on a winding path that avoided the likely locations of human habitation. Twice more they heard evidence of others, once the faint report of a hunting rifle, once the jingling harness of a pack animal somewhere in the distance, but encountered no one directly. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Swift Eagle guided them to a ridge overlooking a small valley. He gestured for Cat to remain low as they approached the ridgeline, then indicated she should crawl the final distance on her stomach. Together they peered over the edge, and Cat's breath caught in her throat. Below them, nestled against the far slope of the valley, stood a collection of weathered buildings, an abandoned mining settlement just as Swift Eagle had described. A larger central structure dominated the arrangement, flanked by what appeared to be bunkhouses and storage sheds. Corrals contained several horses, while smoke rose from chimneys indicating current occupation. "Wade's camp," Swift Eagle confirmed in a whisper barely audible even to Cat's sensitive ears. "Main house is his. Men sleep in the long building. Supplies and stolen goods kept in smaller sheds." Cat studied the layout intently, memorizing details that might prove important. The positioning of guards, two visible, one near the main house and another patrolling between buildings, the number of horses suggesting at least 8 men present, the paths connecting the structures, and potential approaches that offered concealment. "We watch only today," Swift Eagle cautioned. "Learn their patterns. Tomorrow or the next day, when we understand their routines, we may approach closer." They settled into a natural blind formed by boulders and scrub pine, prepared for a long vigil. Swift Eagle produced a small spyglass from his pack, a reminder of his time with the military, which allowed them to observe details that would otherwise have been indistinct at this distance. As daylight waned, activity in the camp increased. Men emerged from various buildings, gathering near a central fire pit. Even from their distant vantage point, Cat could distinguish different figures: a tall, broad-shouldered man who seemed to direct others, a wiry individual with a distinctive red bandana, an older man who walked with a slight limp. But it was a figure who emerged from the main house that captured her complete attention. Even without the spyglass, she would have recognized the confident stride, the way he carried himself with the absolute authority of one accustomed to command: Mason Wade. The mere sight of him sent a cold shock through Cat's system. The architect of her nightmares, the man whose orders had destroyed her family, and countless others, standing in plain view less than half a mile distant. Her hand moved instinctively to the knife at her belt, a futile gesture that Swift Eagle noticed immediately. His hand closed gently but firmly around her wrist, his expression conveying both understanding and caution. Revenge was not their purpose here. Justice was larger than a knife in the dark, more complex than a single death, no matter how deserved. Cat forced her breathing to steady, acknowledging the wisdom in his restraint. They needed more than Wade's death. They needed evidence that would expose the entire conspiracy, that would prevent others from continuing his work if he fell. As the men below gathered for their evening meal, snippets of conversation occasionally carried to the ridge on the evening breeze. Most was indistinct, but suddenly a voice rose clearly, the southern drawl that had haunted Kat's memories for 6 months. "Blackwood's getting impatient," Wade was saying to his assembled men. "Wants us to hit the Jenkins settlement before the month's out. Make it look like retaliation for the wagon train." Another voice responded too low to distinguish words, but Wade's reply carried again. "Don't much care what you think, Collins. Territorial governor wants those Cheyenne pushed onto the reservation by summer's end. Our job is to provide the necessary incentive for public support." Beside her, Swift Eagle had gone utterly still, his body tense as a drawn bowstring. The casual confirmation of their suspicions, spoken in Wade's own voice, was both vindication and fuel for a deeper rage. Cat touched his arm, gently drawing his attention back from whatever dark place his thoughts had traveled. His eyes, when they met hers, contained a storm of emotions held rigidly in check. "You heard," he whispered, his voice rough with controlled fury. "Blackwood still directs him. The governor supports them. It is as I feared, the rot reaches to the highest branches." They continued their observation as darkness settled fully over the valley, watching as the camp prepared for night. Guards changed shifts, men retired to the bunkhouse, and eventually only a few lights remained burning in the main house where Wade presumably resided. When it became apparent they would learn nothing more that evening, Swift Eagle signaled it was time to withdraw. They retreated from the ridge with the same caution they had approached, not speaking until they had put considerable distance between themselves and the valley. "We found them," Swift Eagle said at last as they made a cold camp in a densely wooded draw well away from established trails. "Now we must plan our next steps carefully." Kat nodded, her mind still processing what they had witnessed, not just Wade's presence, but the explicit confirmation of the conspiracy's scope. She withdrew her journal, opening to a fresh page by the dim light of stars filtering through the canopy. Quickly, she sketched the camp's layout, adding notations about guard positions and routines. Swift Eagle watched her work with approval. "Good. We must know their patterns before we can move safely among them." When she had finished documenting their observations, Kat turned to a new page and wrote a single word. When Swift Eagle considered the question carefully. "Not immediately. We must watch for at least 2 days, perhaps 3. Learn when they are most vulnerable." He studied her expression in the darkness. "I understand your impatience, Catherine. 6 months is a long time to wait for justice, but haste now could destroy everything." Why, Kat knew he was right, though every fiber of her being hummed with the need for action now that their quarry was in sight. She had survived 6 months of solitude and grief. She could endure a few more days of watchful waiting. She wrote another question beneath the first. "How we need evidence," Swift Eagle replied. "Something that proves Wade's men attacked both your wagon train and my people's camp. Something that connects him to Blackwood and the territorial officials." He gestured toward the distant valley. "Such proof likely exists in Wade's personal quarters. We must find a way to enter unseen, locate what we need, and depart without raising alarm." The audacity of this plan, 2 people, 1 a child, infiltrating a camp of armed killers, should have terrified Kat. Instead, she felt a strange calm settle over her. After everything she had endured, after months of helpless grief and solitary struggle, the prospect of direct action, however dangerous, offered something she had almost forgotten: purpose. She closed her journal with a decisive motion, then raised her hands to sign her agreement with the plan. Swift Eagle acknowledged with a nod, respecting her determination without feeding it with false promises of easy success. "Sleep now," he advised. "Tomorrow we return to the ridge and learn more of our enemy's habits. Each piece of knowledge is a weapon in our hands." As Kat settled into her bedroll, sheltered beneath an overhanging pine, she found herself not frightened, but strangely exhilarated by the day's developments. For months she had been running, hiding, merely surviving. Now at last she was moving towards something rather than away, advancing rather than retreating. It was a subtle shift, but profound. In that moment beneath the ancient stars of the Montana night, Catherine Sullivan began the long journey from survivor to something more, something her parents might have recognized, might have been proud to see their daughter become a seeker of justice. For 2 more days, they maintained their vigilant observation of Wade's camp, gradually building a comprehensive understanding of its rhythms and vulnerabilities. They noted guard rotations, meal times, the patterns of movement that defined life in the small settlement. Most importantly, they identified periods when vigilance seemed to relax, particularly in the early afternoon, when many men napped or occupied themselves with maintenance tasks after the midday meal. During this time, Cat and Swift Eagle spoke little, communicating primarily through gesture and expression. Each understood the gravity of what they planned, each focused on absorbing details that might mean the difference between success and disaster. On the evening of the second day, as they withdrew once more to their secluded camp, Swift Eagle declared they had learned enough to attempt entry the following afternoon. Wade leaves the main house each day after eating, he explained, as they shared a cold meal of dried venison and gathered greens. Goes to check the horses for 1 hour. During this time, only one guard remains near the house, and he often dozes if the day is warm. Cat nodded, having noticed this pattern herself. She raised her hands to ask a question. How would they approach without being seen? Swift Eagle unfolded a piece of bark on which he had sketched a rough map of the valley. Here, he indicated tracing a route that approached from the east, utilizing a dry stream bed that ran close to the settlement's edge. The path offers cover almost to the back of the main house. If we time our approach with the guard's usual circuit, we can reach the rear window unseen. He looked up, meeting Cat's gaze directly. You are small enough to enter through this window. I cannot fit and would be recognized immediately if seen. This part of the task must be yours alone. Cat absorbed this information with a calm that surprised even herself. The thought of entering Wade's domain unaccompanied should have terrified her, yet she felt only a steady resolve. Perhaps months of solitary survival had burned away ordinary fear, leaving only the capacity for necessary action. She raised her hands again. What am I looking for? Papers, Swift Eagle replied. Letters between Wade and Blackwood. Maps marking attack locations. Payment records. Anything that proves the connection between them and shows the attacks were deliberate strategy, not random violence. He hesitated, then added, such documents would likely be kept secure in a locked desk or cabinet, perhaps a safe if Wade possesses one. You must be prepared to search thoroughly but quickly. Cat considered this challenge, then opened her journal to show Swift Eagle something she had never shared before: detailed sketches of the lock mechanisms her father had taught her about during their journey west. Michael Sullivan, for all his artistic sensibilities, had possessed practical knowledge of many subjects, including how simple locks functioned and could be manipulated. Swift Eagle studied the drawings with surprised appreciation. Your father taught you this, Cat nodded, remembering those lessons on quiet evenings around the wagon train's fires, her father demonstrating with a small practice lock he carried specifically for this purpose, explaining that understanding how things worked was the foundation of true security. A useful skill, Swift Eagle acknowledged, though picking locks takes time we may not have. He considered a moment longer. We should prepare for both possibilities, that you find what we need in plain sight, or that you must open secured containers to discover it. As they continued planning the details of their approach, a comfortable silence eventually fell between them. The enormity of tomorrow's risk hung in the air, acknowledged but not dwelled upon. Both understood that this might be their only opportunity to gather the evidence needed for justice, and both accepted the dangers inherent in seizing it. Later, as they banked their small fire for the night, Swift Eagle surprised Cat by withdrawing his flute. In the days since discovering Wade's camp, they had maintained strict silence after dark, wary of sound carrying in the still mountain air. But tonight, perhaps recognizing the need for something beyond mere strategy, he played very softly a melody Cat hadn't heard before, its phrases both melancholy and resolute. When he finished, he explained in a whisper, a medicine song for protection. Among my people, we believe music can prepare the spirit for difficult journeys. Cat retrieved her own flute from her satchel, raising it in silent question. Swift Eagle nodded, and she began to play, not repeating his melody, but offering a complementary theme that wove around the memory of his notes, like a counterpoint in one of her father's beloved Bach compositions. Together, their distinct musical voices, one Cheyenne, one European, created something new, a harmony neither could have produced alone. It lasted only a few minutes before silence reclaimed the night, but in that brief communion, something shifted between them. No longer simply allies of convenience united by common enemies, they had become something more, partners in a shared language that transcended their different origins. As Kat tucked her flute away, Swift Eagle spoke words that seemed to acknowledge this evolution. "Tomorrow we face danger together," he said quietly. "Know that whatever happens, you have earned a place of honor in my heart, Catherine Sullivan. You have the courage of a true warrior." Coming from Swift Eagle with his habitual reserve and careful speech, this simple declaration carried profound weight. Kat felt its impact like a physical warmth spreading through her chest, a recognition that reached past her muteness and isolation to affirm something essential about who she was, or perhaps who she was becoming. She responded with a sign for honor returned, that Swift Eagle had taught her, adding a gesture of her own creation. Fingers spread over her heart, then extended toward him, offering connection without words. He nodded once, understanding perfectly, then settled into his customary position for the night, back against a tree, facing the direction from which danger might approach, ever vigilant, even in rest. Kat wrapped herself in her blanket, strangely calm, despite the dangers tomorrow would bring. They had prepared as thoroughly as possible. They had a clear purpose and plan. Whatever happened now was in the hands of forces larger than themselves, what Swift Eagle would call the spirits, what her mother might have named Providence. Her last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was a hope wordless but vivid, that her parents somehow knew she had found not just survival in these mountains, but a path toward making meaning from the senseless violence that had taken them from her. Morning arrived with a sky of perfect piercing blue, a day of remarkable clarity after the misty conditions of previous days. As they consumed a light breakfast and made final preparations, Swift Eagle studied the heavens with a slight frown. "Clear skies make for clear sight," he observed. "We will be more visible on our approach." Despite this contemplation, they proceeded with their plan, departing their hidden camp in mid-morning to position themselves closer to the settlement before the optimal entry time. They traveled with extreme caution, utilizing every available feature of the landscape for concealment, freezing into immobility whenever birds or small animals signaled potential human presence nearby. By early afternoon, they had reached the dry stream bed that would serve as their final approach route. Here they paused, concealed among boulders, waiting for the camp's midday activities to settle into the predictable pattern they had observed over previous days. Swift Eagle used this time to prepare Kat for what lay ahead, reviewing the route to Wade's quarters' likely locations for important documents and signals they would use to communicate during the operation. Most critically, he emphasized the contingency plan should things go wrong. "If you are discovered," his hand signed emphatically, "do not try to fight. Run. Use the confusion of the moment. Remember our meeting place, the lightning-struck pine on the eastern ridge. If we are separated, that is where we reunite." Kat nodded her understanding, her expression solemn but composed. Fear flickered at the edge of her awareness, but didn't dominate it. Instead, she focused on committing every detail of their plan to memory, visualizing each step of her route through the settlement. When the appointed time arrived, that drowsy hour when the camp's vigilance ebbed to its lowest point, Swift Eagle signaled it was time to move. Together, they slipped from their hiding place, entering the shallow ravine formed by the stream bed. Moving in a half-crouch, they advanced toward the settlement, using the ravine's banks for cover. The final approach required crossing 20 yards of open ground between the stream bed's end and the back of the main house. They paused at this juncture, waiting for the patrolling guard to complete his circuit around the far side of the building. When the moment came, Swift Eagle squeezed Kat's shoulder once their signal to proceed, and they darted across the open space with swift, silent steps. Reaching the building's shadow, they pressed themselves against its rough wooden walls, listening intently for any sign they had been detected. Nothing. The camp remained quiet, settled into its afternoon lull. Swift Eagle led them along the wall to a window he had identified during their observations, small, likely belonging to a back room rather than the main living area. Its lower edge just high enough that Kat would need assistance to reach it. Positioning himself beneath the window, Swift Eagle created a stirrup with his interlaced fingers. Cat placed her foot in this support, and he boosted her up, enabling her to peer cautiously inside. The room beyond appeared to be a small office or study, a desk positioned beneath another window, bookshelves lining one wall, a cabinet standing against another. Most importantly, it was empty of human presence. Cat signaled this information to Swift Eagle, who nodded and adjusted his stance to provide a more stable platform. With practiced silence, Cat eased the window open, fortunately unlocked, as they had hoped, based on the settlement's isolated location and Wade's apparent confidence in his guards. The opening was narrow but sufficient. Cat slipped in through with the fluid grace she had developed during months of navigating wilderness obstacles, landing lightly on the wooden floor inside. She remained in a crouch for several moments, listening intently for any reaction to her entrance, ready to retreat at the first sign of discovery. The house remained quiet, save for distant sounds from another room, perhaps a ticking clock, perhaps the subtle creaking of a wooden structure settling in the afternoon heat. No voices, no footsteps approaching. Moving with deliberate care, Cat began her search, starting with the most obvious location, the desk that dominated the small room. Its surface held various papers and maps, which she examined quickly, identifying several that might be useful: a chart of the territory with locations marked in red ink, a letter bearing what appeared to be a military seal, a list of names with figures beside them that might indicate payments. She was about to open the desk drawers when a sound froze her in place, footsteps approaching from elsewhere in the house, accompanied by a voice raised in what seemed to be complaint or argument. Cat dropped immediately, sliding beneath the desk, just as the office door swung open. From her concealed position, she could see only the lower portions of the two men who entered, one in dusty boots that she recognized from their observations as belonging to Wade himself, the other in better-kept footwear that suggested a visitor of some status. "I don't care for your excuses, Wade." The visitor's voice carried the clipped tones of formal education, quite different from the drawling cadence of the camp's usual occupants. Blackwood was most explicit about the timeline. "These delays are unacceptable." "Ain't delays, Mr. Lawrence, it's proper planning." Wade's distinctive Southern accent confirmed his identity. "You can't just ride in and slaughter a settlement without preparation, especially not one as well-armed as Jenkins' place. The territorial governor is losing patience. The Indian commissioner visits next month, and we need those Cheyenne confined to the reservation before he arrives. The Jenkins massacre is a necessary catalyst." Wade's boots shifted position as he moved around the desk directly above where Cat huddled in breathless silence. "Your bosses want things neat and official, with all the paperwork showing those savages are to blame. That takes time to arrange proper-like." A derisive snort from the visitor. "Your arrangements have been sloppy. We've received reports of a survivor from the Hollister wagon train, a child possibly, though accounts are unclear. Such loose ends are precisely what we cannot afford." Cat's heart seemed to stop at these words. They knew someone had survived. They were looking for her. "No survivors from Hollister," Wade responded, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. "We were thorough. Checked every body." "Then explain the stories filtering through from trappers about a ghost child in the high country. Explain the missing body from your own count." A heavy silence followed this accusation, broken when Wade yanked open a desk drawer directly above Cat's head. Papers rustled as he searched for something. "Here," he said finally, "the manifest we took from the wagon master's effects. 28 souls in the Hollister train. We found 26 bodies. My men said 2 were likely destroyed in the fire or dragged off by scavengers. Or perhaps," the visitor suggested coldly, "your men were careless. Perhaps someone escaped and has been hiding in these mountains all this time. Someone who saw your men remove their Cheyenne disguises. Someone who could identify you." Wade's boots shifted again as he moved away from the desk. Even if there was a survivor, which I doubt, what could one person do against all this? We've got the governor's office, half the territorial officials, and Colonel Blackwood himself backing our operation. One witness against all, that means nothing. Your complacency is precisely what concerns Blackwood, the visitor snapped. This entire enterprise depends on absolute secrecy regarding who is truly responsible for these attacks. If evidence emerged linking you to both Settler and Cheyenne massacres, the political fallout would be catastrophic. Their voices began to fade as they moved toward the door. I want those woods searched thoroughly, the visitor commanded. Find this rumored survivor if they exist, and accelerate your timeline on the Jenkins settlement. Blackwood wants it done within the week. The door closed behind them, their footsteps and conversation becoming indistinct as they moved deeper into the house. Kat remained frozen beneath the desk, her mind racing with the implications of what she had overheard. The conspiracy was even larger than Swift Eagle had suspected, reaching to the highest levels of territorial government. And now they were actively searching for her, aware that a witness might have survived. When she was certain the men were truly gone, Kat emerged from her hiding place and resumed her search with renewed urgency. The desk drawers yielded little beyond what she had already seen, but a locked cabinet across the room drew her attention next. Recalling her father's lessons, Kat examined the lock carefully. It was a simple mechanism likely chosen for convenience rather than security in this remote location. Using a thin metal pick fashioned from a hairpin her mother had once worn, one of the few personal items she had preserved from the massacre, Kat manipulated the lock with trembling fingers, applying pressure until she felt the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. The cabinet doors swung open to reveal a trove of documents far more damning than those left on the desk. Here were detailed plans for both completed and future attacks, correspondence with Colonel Blackwood that explicitly outlined their strategy of disguised raids, and most significantly, a ledger recording payments from various territorial officials for services rendered. Kat's hands moved quickly, selecting the most incriminating documents and tucking them into her shirt. She was about to close the cabinet when something caught her eye, a small wooden box pushed to the back of a shelf. Something about its craftsmanship struck her as incongruous among Wade's utilitarian possessions. Opening it, she found items that sent a surge of recognition through her core. A silver locket she knew had belonged to Mrs. Hollister, a carved pipe that matched Swift Eagle's description of his brother's prized possession, a collection of personal tokens that could only have been taken from victims of various attacks. Trophies kept not for their monetary value, but as mementos of violence. The discovery sickened her, but also provided the physical evidence they needed, concrete proof linking Wade to both massacres. Kat closed the box and added it to the documents already hidden in her clothing. She was preparing to exit through the window when voices outside the room made her freeze once more. The door handle turned, and in a moment of pure instinct, Kat dove back beneath the desk, pulling her knees tight to her chest just as the door swung open. Wade entered alone this time, muttering to himself about paper-pushing officials and city men who've never gotten their hands dirty. He moved to the desk, settling heavily into the chair directly above Kat's hiding place. For an excruciating eternity, she remained motionless as Wade shuffled papers, occasionally cursing under his breath. The irony of her position was not lost on her, inches away from the man responsible for her family's murder, close enough to strike if she had been foolish enough to attempt it, yet completely focused on escape rather than revenge. When Wade finally rose and left the room, Kat waited until his footsteps had faded completely before emerging from concealment. The afternoon was advancing. She had been inside the house far longer than planned. Swift Eagle would be growing concerned. Moving to the window, she peered carefully outside. Swift Eagle remained in position below his expression, betraying a relief when he caught sight of her. Kat displayed the documents briefly to indicate success, then prepared to exit the same way she had entered. As she eased herself through the narrow opening, a sudden commotion erupted from elsewhere in the camp. Shouting voices, running footsteps, the unmistakable sound of conflict. Swift Eagle gestured urgently for her to hurry, his expression conveying alarm. Kat dropped from the window into his waiting arms and he set her quickly on her feet. "Guards found something," he whispered tersely. "We must go now." They were halfway to the cover of the stream bed when a shout went up behind them. "There by the main house." Any hope of stealth abandoned, they broke into a run, sprinting for the ravine that had concealed their approach. Gunshots cracked behind them, bullets kicking up dirt nearby, but the hasty fire was inaccurate at this distance. They reached the stream bed and plunged down its bank, using its winding course as cover, while they fled. Swift Eagle led them not back the way they had come, but on a different route, steeper, more difficult, but less likely to be anticipated by pursuers. "What happened?" Kat sighed frantically as they paused behind a massive boulder, listening for sounds of pursuit. Swift Eagle's expression was grim. "They brought in a prisoner while you were inside. A Cheyenne woman. I recognized her Morning Star, my sister." The revelation struck Kat with physical force. Swift Eagle had never mentioned a sister, had spoken only of his brother's family being killed in the raid. "I thought she died in the attack on our hunting camp." He continued, answering Kat's unspoken question. "She must have been taken captive instead. When I saw her," his hands faltered briefly, "I could not leave her there." Understanding dawned. While Kat had been searching Wade's office, Swift Eagle had attempted to free his sister, a desperate gamble that had compromised their carefully planned operation. "Did you reach her?" Kat signed. Swift Eagle shook his head, anguish briefly visible beneath his composed exterior. "Guards intervened. I had to retreat or risk capturing us both." His jaw tightened. "But now I know she lives, and we will return for her." The sound of pursuit growing closer ended their exchange. They continued their flight, moving as quickly as possible, while still maintaining some measure of stealth. Kat matched Swift Eagle stride for stride, despite her smaller size, months of wilderness living, having built both her endurance and agility. They climbed steadily, heading for higher ground, where the dense forest would provide better concealment. By the time they reached a rocky outcropping that offered a vantage point back the way they had come, the sounds of pursuit had grown more distant, suggesting they had at least temporarily evaded their hunters. Swift Eagle studied the terrain below his experienced eyes, picking out tiny movements that revealed the positions of Wade's men. "They have split into 3 groups," he observed, "trying to surround us rather than follow directly." Kat nodded her understanding of the tactic, then removed the documents from her shirt, offering them to Swift Eagle. He examined them quickly, his expression darkening as he absorbed their contents. "This is what we needed," he confirmed, carefully stowing the papers in the wooden box in his own pack. "Names, dates, payments, enough to expose the entire conspiracy." He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "You have done well, Catherine. Very well." Despite their precarious situation, Kat felt a surge of pride at his approval. She had succeeded in her task, had secured the evidence they needed for justice. Whatever happened now, that accomplishment could not be taken from her. Swift Eagle's next words, however, tempered this momentary triumph. "But our danger has increased. The man with Wade, you heard him." Kat nodded, raising her hands to explain what she had overheard while hiding beneath the desk. Swift Eagle's expression grew increasingly troubled as she detailed the visitor's instructions regarding the ghost child and the planned attack on the Jenkins settlement. "Lawrence," he said when she had finished. "The name is familiar. I believe he works directly for the territorial governor, a special agent for Indian affairs." His mouth twisted around the words. "Now we know the conspiracy reaches even higher than Blackwood. The governor himself is involved." This confirmation of the plot's scope was sobering. They were not simply facing a rogue military officer and a band of hired killers, but corruption that infested the very institutions meant to administer justice and protect citizens. "We must reach Fort Ellis," Swift Eagle decided, naming the nearest military outpost not under Blackwood's direct command. "There is a captain there, Campbell, who once intervened to prevent mistreatment of Cheyenne prisoners. He might listen where others would not." Kat frowned, raising her hands to ask how they could trust any military officer given Blackwood's position of authority. "We cannot know for certain," Swift Eagle acknowledged, "but these documents may speak loudly enough that even those who distrust a Cheyenne's word will be forced to listen." He studied her face. "It is a risk, but one we must take. The Jenkins settlement must be warned and Morning Star freed. We cannot accomplish either alone." The sound of voices from below interrupted their discussion, searchers growing closer once more. Swift Eagle gestured for silence, then indicated they should continue moving upslope toward the ridgeline that would eventually lead to their emergency rendezvous point. They traveled in tense silence for the next hour, moving as quietly as possible while maintaining distance from their pursuers. The terrain grew increasingly challenging, steep slopes giving way to near vertical rock faces that required careful climbing. Kat's smaller size occasionally proved advantageous, allowing her to slip through passages that forced Swift Eagle to find alternative routes. By late afternoon, they had reached a high saddle between two peaks, a natural corridor that would lead them eastward toward Fort Ellis if they could follow it safely. Here, Swift Eagle called a brief halt both to rest and to assess their situation. "We have gained some distance," he observed, studying the forest below. "But they continue to follow. Wade will not abandon the search easily, not with what you have taken." Kat nodded her understanding, then raised her hands to ask a question that had been forming since their flight began. Why had Swift Eagle never mentioned his sister? A shadow crossed his weathered features. "I believe Morningstar dead." When I regained consciousness after the attack on our camp, I found my brother's family killed many others as well. Morningstar's lodge was burned with remains inside. His hands stilled momentarily. I thought I had buried her with the others. He looked away, gazing toward the distant horizon, to discover she lives, that she has been Wade's captive all this time. The raw anguish in his voice transcended the careful restraint he typically maintained. "I have failed her twice now. First in not protecting her, then in not finding her sooner." Kat reached out impulsively, placing her small hand on Swift Eagle's arm, a gesture of sympathy and understanding that required no signs or words. She knew too well the corrosive power of such guilt had carried her own burden of perceived failure regarding her family. Swift Eagle covered her hand briefly with his own, acknowledging the comfort offered before returning to their practical situation. "We should continue while daylight remains. The night will make travel more difficult, but also aid in concealing our trail." They had just risen to resume their journey when a sound froze them both in place, the distinctive crack of a rifle much closer than any previous shot. A heartbeat later, Swift Eagle grunted in pain, staggering as a bullet tore through his left arm. "Go," he urged, pushing Kat toward the cover of nearby rocks as a second shot splintered bark from a tree beside them. "Run for the meeting place." But Kat refused to abandon him, instead helping Swift Eagle behind the rocks, her expression resolute despite the fear evident in her eyes. Together they crouched in their meager shelter as more shots struck nearby, betraying the presence of at least two shooters converging on their position. Swift Eagle assessed his wound, quickly painful and bleeding freely, but not immediately life-threatening. He tore a strip from his shirt, and Kat helped bind the injury with practiced motions that spoke of her mother's medical teachings. "We are cornered here," Swift Eagle said grimly, peering around their shelter to gauge their attackers' positions. "They have the advantage of higher ground and weapons." More gunfire punctuated his assessment, keeping them pinned in their precarious refuge. Kat's mind raced, considering and discarding possible escape routes. The saddle they had been following offered the only feasible path forward, but it would mean exposing themselves to direct fire. Going back would lead them into the arms of other pursuers. Climbing higher seemed equally impossible, given the sheer rock faces surrounding them. As if reading her thoughts, Swift Eagle made a decision. "The evidence must reach Fort Ellis," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "That is what matters now, more than my life or yours." He removed the pack containing the documents and pressed it into Kat's hands. "You must go on alone. You are smaller, faster without me. Use the skills I have taught you." Horror filled Kat's expression as she realized what he was suggesting. She shook her head vehemently, refusing to accept his plan. "Listen to me, Catherine," Swift Eagle insisted, gripping her shoulders. "I will create a diversion, draw their fire to allow your escape. The Lightning Pine is 2 miles east along this ridgeline. From there, you can descend to the valley that leads to Fort Ellis." Kat continued shaking her head, tears gathering in her eyes. Her hands formed desperate signs. "Together, we promised." "Some promises must yield to greater needs," Swift Eagle replied gently. "The lives at the Jenkins settlement, my sister, justice for both our families, all depend on these documents reaching those who can act on them." A bullet struck perilously close to their position, showering them with stone fragments. Time was running out. Swift Eagle pressed his bone whistle into Kat's hand, closing her fingers around it. For courage, he said, and remembrance. Before she could protest further, he removed his hunting knife and pressed it into her other hand. Now go. Bear witness, little ghost. Speak with the voice you have found. Music signs the truth in these papers. Make them hear. With that, he rose partially from cover and fired his own weapon, not at their attackers, but at a deadfall of timber perched precariously on the slope above. The shot struck true, dislodging the massive logs, which began to rumble downward toward one group of pursuers. In the ensuing confusion, Swift Eagle darted from their shelter in the opposite direction from the path he wanted Kat to take, deliberately drawing attention and fire. Kat hesitated only a moment before accepting the necessity of his sacrifice. Clutching the precious pack to her chest, she slipped away as instructed, using every technique of silent movement Swift Eagle had taught her. Behind her, gunfire intensified, but she did not look back. To do so would dishonor Swift Eagle's choice, would render his diversion meaningless. Instead, she focused entirely on her path forward, on becoming the ghost that Wade's men believed her to be, insubstantial, untouchable, a spirit moving through the wilderness. The afternoon light was fading by the time Kat reached the lightning-struck pine that marked their emergency rendezvous point. Here she paused briefly, assessing her situation with the cold practicality survival demanded. She was alone, once more pursued by dangerous men, carrying evidence that could mean life or death for an entire settlement. Swift Eagle's fate remained unknown, captured wounded, or worse, but she could not allow herself to dwell on possibilities she couldn't change. Her path was clear: reach Fort Ellis with the documents. Everything else must be secondary. Checking the pack's contents one final time, to ensure nothing had been lost during her flight, Kat descended from the ridge into the eastern valley. The terrain here was less familiar, but Swift Eagle had described the route to Fort Ellis with characteristic precision. Follow the valley floor until it joined a larger valley with a river. Travel north along this river for approximately 10 miles. The fort would be visible on a plateau overlooking the river's eastern bank. Night fell as she traveled the waxing moon, providing just enough light to navigate by. Kat moved steadily, resting only when absolutely necessary, knowing that Wade's men would resume their search at first light if they had not already organized a night pursuit. The bone whistle hung from a cord around her neck, bouncing gently against her chest with each step. Its presence provided strange comfort, a tangible connection to Swift Eagle, a reminder of his teachings and sacrifice. Occasionally her hand would rise to touch it, drawing strength from the simple object's solidity when her resolve faltered. Dawn found her approaching the larger valley Swift Eagle had described, the silver ribbon of a substantial river visible in the distance. Kat paused on a small rise, surveying the terrain ahead. The valley offered both opportunity and risk: easier travel, but less cover; faster progress, but greater visibility to potential pursuers. As she considered her options, a new sound reached her sensitive ears: hoofbeats approaching from the north. Multiple riders moving at a steady trot rather than a gallop, suggesting a patrol or regular travel rather than pursuit. Kat retreated into the shelter of nearby pines, concealing herself while maintaining a view of the trail below. Minutes later, a group of riders appeared: 5 men in the distinctive uniforms of U.S. cavalry, led by an officer whose bearing suggested authority. Her heart raced with conflicting impulses. These men represented her best hope of reaching Fort Ellis quickly, of delivering the evidence before Wade's men could intercept her. Yet they were also part of the military establishment that included Blackwood, potentially enemies rather than allies. Swift Eagle had mentioned a Captain Campbell at Fort Ellis who might be trustworthy. Could this be his patrol? The risk of revealing herself was enormous, but so was the opportunity. Decision crystallized within her. Kat emerged from concealment, moving deliberately into the center of the trail where the riders would see her. She held the pack containing the documents clearly visible in her hands, making no threatening movements, but also showing no fear. The patrol spotted her immediately, reining in with exclamations of surprise. The lead officer raised his hand, signaling his men to hold position as he studied the unexpected apparition before them. A small figure with the bearing of a child, but the watchful stillness of something wild-faced, still bearing traces of Swift Eagle's protective paint. "Good Lord," the officer said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "Are you lost, child?" Kat shook her head, then gestured to the pack she carried. The officer dismounted, slowly approaching with the caution one might use with a nervous deer. He was a man of perhaps 40 with a weathered face and kind eyes that evaluated without judgment. "Can you speak?" he asked, stopping at a respectful distance. Again, Kat shook her head. "Are you from a settlement nearby? Do you have family looking for you?" A third headshake, more emphatic this time. Kat opened the pack, removing the most damning document, the ledger detailing payments for attacks, and held it out to the officer. He accepted it with a puzzled expression that quickly transformed to shock as he scanned its contents. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his tone sharpening with urgency. Kat removed more papers from the pack, spreading them before him like a silent testimony. The officer knelt to examine them, his expression growing increasingly grim with each new document. "Mason Wade," he muttered, recognizing the name. "And Colonel Blackwood." He looked up at Kat with new intensity. "Do you understand what these papers show, child?" Kat nodded firmly. "Captain," one of the mounted soldiers called. "Riders approaching from the south. Moving fast." The officer made a swift decision. "Whatever the full story here, it's clear you're in danger." He gathered the documents, quickly returning them to the pack. "I'm Captain James Campbell of Fort Ellis. Will you trust me to help you?" The name Swift Eagle had mentioned the officer he believed might listen. Kat's decision was immediate. She nodded, accepting the outstretched hand that helped her mount behind the captain on his horse. "Patrol form up," Campbell ordered. "We're returning to the fort at speed. Be prepared for possible hostile engagement." As the patrol wheeled northward, accelerating to a gallop that ate up the miles toward Fort Ellis, Kat maintained her grip on both the captain's uniform and Swift Eagle's whistle. The evidence was secure in the hands of the very officer they had hoped to reach. One part of their mission was nearing completion. But Swift Eagle remained behind, his fate unknown. Morning Star remained captive, and the Jenkins settlement still faced imminent attack. Just as Kat was learning came neither easily nor completely. It arrived in fragments, hard-won, and often at terrible cost. As Fort Ellis appeared on the horizon, its flag visible against the morning sky, she could only hope that the price paid thus far would purchase enough justice to make the sacrifice worthwhile. For Swift Eagle, for her parents, for all those whose voices had been silenced by violence and greed. Fort Ellis rose from the plains like a wooden island in a sea of grass, its palisade walls and watchtowers creating a stark geometry against the natural landscape. As Captain Campbell's patrol approached, trumpets sounded, announcing their return and triggering the opening of the main gates. Kat observed everything with the alert wariness as they entered the fort's confines. Soldiers moved with disciplined purpose between buildings arranged around a central parade ground. A flagpole dominated this open space, the stars and stripes snapping in the morning breeze. Horses nickered from a stable area, while smoke rose from what appeared to be a mess hall. It was a world entirely foreign to her experience, neither the civilized Boston of her early childhood, nor the untamed wilderness of her recent months. Here was human organization imposed with military precision, a place of rules and hierarchy unlike anything in her memory. Campbell dismounted, then helped Kat down from his horse. "Come with me," he said, his manner brisk but not unkind. "What you've brought needs immediate attention." He led her toward the largest building, identified by a sign as headquarters, maintaining a protective position slightly ahead of her. Kat noted this consideration with cautious gratitude. The captain seemed to understand her vulnerability without drawing attention to it. Inside, Campbell bypassed several junior officers, proceeding directly to a private office at the rear of the building. "Wait here," he instructed, indicating a bench outside the door. "I need to speak with the commander alone first." Kat settled onto the bench, still clutching Swift Eagle's whistle, her senses heightened by the unfamiliar surroundings. Soldiers passing in the hallway regarded her with curious glances, but asked no questions, deferring to the captain's obvious authority in the matter. From beyond the closed door came the murmur of voices, Campbell's clear tenor, and another deeper voice that occasionally rose in what sounded like disbelief or anger. The conversation continued for what seemed an eternity to Kat's strained nerves, but was likely no more than 20 minutes. Finally, the door opened and Campbell beckoned her inside. "The commander wants to speak with you directly," he explained. The office beyond was austere but comfortable. A large desk dominated the space, flanked by maps of the territory pinned to the walls, and a glass-fronted cabinet containing military manuals and record books. Behind the desk stood a man in his 50s, silver-haired and straight-backed, with the weathered features of someone who had spent decades in frontier service. "This is Commander Robert Harding," Campbell introduced. "Sir, this is the child who provided the documents." Harding studied Kat with penetrating eyes that missed nothing, her still visible wilderness adaptations, the traces of Cheyenne paint on her skin, the bone whistle she clutched like a talisman. "Captain Campbell has shown me some remarkable papers, young lady," he said finally, his voice carrying the gravitas of long command. "If authentic, they represent a conspiracy of extraordinary scope and malice." He gestured to a chair positioned before his desk. "Please sit. I understand you cannot speak, but perhaps we can find another way for you to tell us what we need to know." Kat perched on the edge of the offered chair, her posture remaining alert rather than relaxed. The commander noticed this vigilance but made no comment on it. "First, we need to establish who you are," Harding continued. "Captain Campbell has a theory based on certain correlations in timing and location." He opened a file on his desk. "Approximately 6 months ago, a wagon train led by one Jeremiah Hollister was reported missing en route to the northern settlements. When a patrol finally located the site, they found evidence of a massacre attributed to Cheyenne raiders." He looked up, meeting Kat's gaze directly. "Were you part of that wagon train?" Kat nodded, her expression darkening at the memory. "I see." Harding made a note. "And you survived by—" Kat mimed, hiding, then fleeing into the wilderness. "You witnessed the attack then?" Another nod. "And saw something that contradicts the official report of Cheyenne responsibility." Kat's nod this time was emphatic. She pointed to the documents spread across Harding's desk, then to herself, trying to convey that her testimony confirmed what was written there. Campbell intervened. "Sir, if I may suggest, perhaps paper and pencil would allow her to communicate more specifically." Harding nodded agreement, providing the requested materials. Kat accepted them gratefully, though her handwriting was rusty after months of disuse. Slowly she wrote her full name, then added, "Raiders wore disguises. White men. Leader named Wade." Harding studied her words. "And these same men are planning an attack on the Jenkins settlement, according to these documents." Kat wrote again within week. "Blame Cheyenne. And your companion, this Cheyenne man mentioned in the papers. Swift Eagle. Where is he now?" The question sent a pang through Kat's chest. She wrote, "Captured or killed. Sacrificed himself so I could escape with evidence." A respectful silence followed this revelation. Even Harding, with his military stoicism, seemed affected by the simple declaration of such courage. "There's something else, sir," Campbell said, breaking the silence. "The riders we spotted approaching from the south, they weren't ordinary travelers. They were moving with purpose directly on this child's trail. If it's Wade's men, then they may come here next." Harding finished, his expression hardening. "Seeking to recover these documents and eliminate the witness." He rose from his desk, decision crystallizing. "Captain, I want the fort on alert status. Double the guards, challenge all approaches. No one enters without thorough identification." "Yes, sir." "And send a detachment immediately to warn the Jenkins settlement. They're less than a day's ride north. 30 armed men should reach them by nightfall." "What about Colonel Blackwood, sir?" Campbell asked carefully. "These documents implicate him directly. As your superior officer." "I'm well aware of the chain of command," Captain Harding replied, his tone dry, "and of the consequences of acting against it." He tapped the documents. "But I'm also aware of my oath to protect American citizens, be they settlers or natives under treaty protection." "If Blackwood is involved in orchestrating attacks on either, that supersedes any obligation of military hierarchy." He turned back to Kat. "Young lady, you've shown remarkable courage in bringing this information to us. You'll remain under fort protection while we investigate these claims and take action to prevent further attacks." Kat shook her head vigorously, writing, "Must rescue Swift Eagle and his sister. Captives at Wade's camp." Harding frowned. "That's not possible. Wade's camp is a significant force based on these reports. A rescue operation would require careful planning, and we don't have confirmation your companions are still alive. Kat's expression hardened with determination. She wrote, I can identify the camp. Know its layout. Swift Eagle saved my life. Can't abandon him. Campbell studied her with newfound respect. Sir, if she can guide us to the camp, it would significantly increase our chances of success. We'd no longer be searching blind. Harding considered this argument, weighing military practicalities against moral imperatives. Very well, he conceded finally. We'll organize a reconnaissance force, small mobile, focused on assessment rather than engagement. If your companions can be located and extracted without major conflict, we'll attempt it. He fixed Kat with a stern gaze. But you will remain here under protection. That is non-negotiable. Kat opened her mouth to protest a silent objection that nonetheless conveyed her frustration clearly, but Harding raised his hand to forestall argument. You've done your part, Catherine Sullivan. More than could be expected of anyone, let alone a child. Now allow those of us with the proper resources to do ours. The logic was irrefutable, however much it chafed against Kat's fierce loyalty to Swift Eagle. She had delivered the evidence as promised. She had set in motion the mechanisms of official response. Further involvement would likely endanger rather than aid the rescue effort. With reluctant acceptance, she nodded her agreement to Harding's terms. Good. The commander turned to Campbell. Captain, see that Miss Sullivan receives medical attention, proper meals, and secure quarters. Then assemble your best scouts and trackers for a briefing. I want your reconnaissance force ready to depart by midday. Yes, sir. As Campbell led her from the office, Kat cast one final glance back at the documents spread across Harding's desk, the physical evidence of Wade's crimes, the tangible proof of the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. In those papers lay the potential for justice, but also the catalyst for dangerous confrontations yet to come. What had begun as a personal quest for truth had expanded into something far larger, a challenge to systemic corruption that threatened the fragile peace of the entire territory. And Kat, despite her youth and silence, had become a pivotal figure in this unfolding drama. The knowledge was both empowering and terrifying. As she followed Campbell through Fort Ellis's orderly pathways, surrounded by the trappings of military might and official authority, Catherine Sullivan found herself in yet another unfamiliar landscape, not the Boston of her birth, nor the wilderness of her survival, but the complex terrain of adult conflicts where justice and power maintained an uneasy, often contradictory relationship. All she could do now was trust that the truth she had delivered would prove strong enough to overcome the forces arrayed against it, and hope that Swift Eagle, wherever he might be, would hold on until help could reach him. Her hand closed once more around the bone whistle at her throat, a promise, a connection, a silent prayer that their separation would be temporary rather than permanent. Some journeys, she was learning, didn't end with arrival at a destination. They merely transformed into new journeys with different challenges and companions. Her path forward remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. She was no longer the same child who had hidden beneath a fallen pine 6 months earlier, watching her world burn. That Catherine Sullivan had died with her family. The person who emerged from the wilderness, part ghost, part warrior, equally at home in silence and in music, was someone new, still forming, still discovering the full measure of her strength and purpose. For now, that purpose remained focused on a single, unwavering goal, ensuring Swift Eagle's sacrifice had not been in vain. Fort Ellis existed in a state of controlled urgency following Kat's arrival. Commander Harding had immediately dispatched riders to warn the Jenkins settlement, while Captain Campbell prepared a reconnaissance force to locate Wade's camp, and if possible, rescue Swift Eagle and Morning Star. Kat, meanwhile, found herself in an unsettling limbo, neither prisoner nor guest, but a protected witness whose value lay in both the information she had delivered and her potential testimony should official investigations follow. She had been given a small room in the officers' quarters, plain but comfortable by military standards. A uniformed young woman introduced as Sarah Bennett, the fort doctor's assistant, had been assigned to tend to her immediate needs. Sarah had examined Kat's physical condition, treated minor injuries acquired during her flight from Wade's men, and arranged for proper meals and clean clothing. Now, as evening approached, Kat sat on the narrow bed in her temporary quarters, feeling oddly disconnected from her surroundings. The room's rigid angles and manufactured uniformity stood in stark contrast to both the organic curves of her wilderness cave and the harmonious functionality of Swift Eagle's camps. Even the sounds were foreign, the rhythmic march of centuries, the distant bugle calls marking military time, the muffled conversations from adjacent rooms, nothing like the whispering pines and nightbirds she had grown accustomed to. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah entered carrying a tray with a steaming bowl of stew and fresh bread. "I'm glad to hear that," Elizabeth replied. "Speaking such truths requires its own kind of courage, different from wilderness survival, but no less demanding." She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. "Father has told me something of your circumstances, your months alone, your alliance with Swift Eagle. It's remarkable. Few would have survived such experiences, let alone emerged with the strength to seek justice rather than merely safety." Kat shrugged, slightly uncomfortable with praise for what had been at its core simply the refusal to surrender to death or despair. On her slate, she wrote, "Had no choice but to survive." Then Swift Eagle showed purpose beyond survival. "Purpose makes all the difference, doesn't it?" Elizabeth observed. "It transforms mere existence into meaningful life." She studied Kat with renewed interest. "Have you given thought to what comes after? Once the testimony is complete and justice set in motion?" It was the question that had hovered at the edges of Kat's consciousness since Fort Ellis, that Swift Eagle had raised during their journey to Helena. The future beyond immediate concerns remained hazy, filled with competing possibilities and obligations. She wrote hesitantly, "Judge Wilson mentioned relatives in East, returning to school. Becoming normal again." "Is that what you want?" Elizabeth asked directly, her tone suggesting genuine interest rather than judgment. Kat's response was immediate and definitive, "Not possible. Too different now." Elizabeth nodded, unsurprised by this assessment. "I thought as much. The experiences you've had, they change a person fundamentally. There's no returning to who you were before, only moving forward as who you've become." She leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "May I offer a perspective, not as instruction, but as possibility?" Kat nodded, curious about what this educated woman who had chosen frontier life over Eastern comfort might suggest. "The West needs boundary crossers," Elizabeth said simply. "People who understand both worlds, Eastern education and frontier reality, white society and native wisdom, especially children who will shape the future of these territories." She gestured toward the window beyond which lay Helena's curious mixture of civilization and wilderness. "I came west to teach because I believed education here shouldn't simply replicate Eastern models, but create something new that honors both traditions. That's why I'm establishing a school at the edge of Helena, one that welcomes both settler and native children, that teaches reading and writing alongside practical survival and traditional knowledge." The concept resonated with Kat's emerging sense of herself as existing between categories, rather than fully within any single tradition. She wrote, "A place for those who don't fully belong in either world." "Exactly," Elizabeth confirmed, pleased by Kat's quick understanding. "A place where difference becomes strength rather than limitation, where multiple perspectives create wisdom rather than conflict." She hesitated briefly before adding, "If such a place might interest you, not immediately perhaps, but when current matters are resolved, there would be a position for someone with your unique experiences. Not as student only, but as assistant teacher as well. Someone who could help bridge the gaps between different ways of understanding the world." The offer, presented without pressure or presumption, planted a seed of possibility in Kat's mind. Not the complete return to conventional civilization that Fort Ellis authorities had assumed, nor the full adoption of Cheyenne life that might prove increasingly difficult as reservations replaced traditional territories, but a third path that valued rather than rejected her complex identity. She wrote thoughtfully, "Would need to discuss with Swift Eagle. He has become family in strange way." "Of course," Elizabeth agreed readily. "I wouldn't suggest separating you from those connections. In fact, Swift Eagle's wisdom would be invaluable to such a school should he ever wish to share it." She rose, preparing to leave Kat to her rest. "It's merely a thought for the future when justice has been secured and wounds have begun healing. Sleep well, Catherine. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." After Elizabeth departed, Kat found herself contemplating this unexpected possibility as she prepared for sleep. The concept of helping create something new that honored both aspects of her experience offered a purpose beyond the immediate quest for justice, a way to transform personal tragedy into broader healing, to build bridges where others had created division. Whether such a path would prove viable remained uncertain. Justice for her family and Swift Eagle's people must come first. Wade and Blackwood must face consequences for their crimes. The conspiracy that had claimed so many lives must be exposed and dismantled. But beyond those immediate imperatives, Elizabeth's suggestion offered something Kat had not fully recognized. She needed not just survival or even justice, but meaningful future. A way to integrate rather than compartmentalize the complex person she had become through loss and resilience, silence and music, civilization and wilderness. As sleep finally claimed her, Kat's last conscious thought was of Swift Eagle's birthdays about boundary crossers being valued for their unique perspective. Perhaps in this territory of colliding worlds, her very in-betweenness might prove not limitation, but gift, not weakness, to overcome, but strength to cultivate. The answer would emerge in its own time. For now, tomorrow's testimony awaited the next step on a journey whose ultimate destination remained as yet unwritten. Morning arrived with a sense of momentous occasion pervading the Wilson household. The federal investigator, a stern, precise man named Lawrence Blackwood, had arrived on the early train from Washington, bringing with him the full authority of the Justice Department and a team of assistants prepared to document testimony for potential prosecution. Kat noted with interest the investigator's surname, wondering about possible relation to Colonel Blackwood himself. Judge Wilson confirmed her suspicion privately before proceedings began. Thomas Blackwood is the Colonel's younger brother, he explained quietly. A fact which makes his appointment particularly significant. The Attorney General deliberately chose someone who cannot be accused of bias against the Colonel, yet whose legal reputation for integrity is unimpeachable. This strategic selection suggested the federal government was taking the conspiracy allegations with appropriate seriousness, preparing for potential resistance from territorial authorities by establishing unassailable procedural legitimacy. The formal testimonies were conducted in Judge Wilson's library, converted to a quasi-official hearing room with stenographers recording every statement. Swift Eagle was called first, his testimony delivered with dignified precision, despite his still healing injuries. He recounted the attack on his people's hunting camp, his discovery of the massacre site where Kat's family had died, and his eventual alliance with the ghost child to obtain evidence of Wade's dual identity. Morningstar followed her account of months in captivity, adding crucial details about conversations overheard between Wade and his men, as well as visits from Colonel Blackwood himself to the camp where she was held. Her testimony directly linked the colonel to specific attack plans, confirming his role as architect rather than mere enabler of the violence. When Kat's turn came, she faced a logistical challenge due to her continued muteness. Judge Wilson had anticipated this difficulty, arranging for her to provide written responses to questions, with Elizabeth serving as reader, to vocalize her testimony for the official record. Investigator Blackwood approached Kat's unusual circumstance with formal but genuine consideration. "Miss Sullivan," he began, "I understand you witnessed the attack on the Hollister wagon train, but are currently unable to speak. Please know that your testimony is no less valued for being delivered in writing rather than speech." He proceeded methodically through questions about what Kat had seen and heard during the massacre, paying particular attention to her observations of the raiders removing native disguises afterward, and the conversation she had overheard regarding territorial officials and planned deception. Kat responded with careful precision, her slate filled and erased repeatedly as she provided detailed accounts of each aspect Blackwood inquired about. The process was exhausting but oddly cathartic, transforming private horror into public record, converting memory from personal burden to official evidence. When asked about her subsequent wilderness survival, an alliance with Swift Eagle, Kat described their mutual recognition of Wade's responsibility for both massacres and their determination to obtain proof that would bring justice for all victims, regardless of origin. Throughout this testimony, Elizabeth read Kat's written words with appropriate gravity and clarity, occasionally pausing to allow Kat to expand on particularly significant points. The stenographers captured everything, creating an official record that would stand as foundation for subsequent legal proceedings. As the session neared its conclusion, Investigator Blackwood posed a final unexpected question. "Miss Sullivan, beyond the specific events you've described, is there anything else you believe this inquiry should know? Any observation or insight from your unique perspective that might help us understand the full scope of what occurred?" Kat considered this invitation carefully. On her slate, she wrote a response that Elizabeth read with particular emphasis. The men who killed my family and attacked Swift Eagle's people believed they could create hatred between settlers and natives through deception. They assumed neither side would look beyond appearances to discover truth. They were wrong. This conspiracy succeeded only because people chose to believe what matched their existing fears rather than questioning what they were told. True justice requires seeing past disguises, both literal and figurative, to recognize our common humanity. A thoughtful silence followed this statement, Blackwood regarding the cat with newfound respect. Wisdom beyond your years, Miss Sullivan, he acknowledged. In a perspective, this investigation, indeed this territory, would do well to remember. With testimonies complete, Blackwood outlined subsequent steps in the process, formal charges to be filed against Wade Colonel Blackwood and their associates, evidence to be presented to a federal grand jury, and protective measures for key witnesses until trial proceedings could be secured. The wheels of justice turn slowly but grind exceedingly fine, he concluded, borrowing the ancient proverb. What you have provided today ensures they cannot be stopped from turning, regardless of what resistance territorial authorities might attempt. As the formal proceedings concluded and Blackwood's team organized their extensive notes, Judge Wilson invited everyone to a late lunch prepared by his household staff. The meal offered welcome respite from the morning's emotional intensity, though conversation remained subdued, each person processing the significance of what had been shared and documented. Swift Eagle, seated beside Kat at the judge's table, spoke quietly for her ears alone. You spoke well through written words, Catherine Sullivan. Your parents would be proud of the truth-teller their daughter has become. The simple acknowledgement touched something deep within Kat, recognition, not just of what she had endured, but of how she had chosen to respond to tragedy. Not with hatred or vengeance, but with determined pursuit of truth that might prevent others from suffering similar loss. As lunch concluded, Investigator Blackwood approached Kat once more. Miss Sullivan, there is a practical matter we must address regarding your future arrangements. As a minor without guardian present, the court must make certain determinations about your placement until more permanent solutions can be established. He glanced toward Judge Wilson before continuing. Judge Wilson has suggested you might remain under his household's protection during immediate legal proceedings, with his daughter providing educational support. However, we have also located your father's half-brother in Oregon, who has expressed willingness to assume guardianship once travel can be safely arranged. Kat's response was immediate and firm. On her slate, she wrote, wish to remain near Swift Eagle and Morning Star until justice secured. Blackwood nodded, unsurprised by this preference. A reasonable request given your shared experiences, and Judge Wilson has indeed indicated his household can accommodate all three of you for the necessary period. He hesitated briefly before adding, but I must ask about longer-term considerations, Miss Sullivan. Once legal matters are resolved, have you given thought to where your future might lead? It was the question that had followed Kat from Wilderness to Fort Ellis to Helena, the persistent assumption that a child must ultimately return to conventional structures and expectations. Yet the seeds planted by Elizabeth's suggestion the previous evening had taken root overnight, offering possibility where before Kat had seen only constraint. She wrote with new confidence, Elizabeth Wilson suggested school for both settler and native children. Place where different traditions respected might help there. Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression suggested intrigued consideration rather than dismissal. An unconventional path, certainly, but perhaps appropriate given unconventional circumstances. He glanced toward Elizabeth, who had joined their conversation. Miss Wilson, this educational venture, you envision it has official sanction. Territorial Education Board approval, yes, Elizabeth confirmed, with supplemental funding from Eastern philanthropic organizations interested in more enlightened approaches to cultural integration. She added with quiet emphasis, Catherine would not be the only child affected by violence finding new purpose there. Several Cheyenne children orphaned by similar misunderstandings have already been promised positions. Blackwood absorbed this information thoughtfully. I see. In Swift Eagle's involvement, advisory capacity initially, Elizabeth replied, though we hope for more substantial participation as the program develops. His knowledge would be invaluable, particularly regarding traditional medicine and sustainable practices. The investigator nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he recognized larger implications beyond immediate placement decisions. Such initiatives represent precisely the kind of bridge building this territory requires if further violence is to be prevented. He turned back to Kat. I will note your preference in my official recommendations, Miss Sullivan. While final determinations rest with the court, your demonstrated maturity in the unique circumstances of your situation warrants special consideration. It wasn't definitive approval, but it represented acknowledgement of Kat's agency in determining her own future recognition that conventional solutions might not best serve a child whose experiences had been anything but conventional. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Judge Wilson's property, Kat found herself drawn to the garden where Swift Eagle sat in quiet conversation with Morning Star, both enjoying rare moments of peace after months of captivity and pursuit. She approached hesitantly, not wishing to intrude on their reunion, but Swift Eagle gestured welcomingly for her to join them. We were speaking of what comes next, he explained as Kat settled beside them on a stone bench. The white man's justice moves forward, but our people's future remains uncertain. Morningstar regarded Kat with gentle curiosity. My brother says you found your voice in silence, that you speak through music and gesture more clearly than many who use words. Kat nodded, touched by this characterization of her adaptation rather than disability. On her slate, she wrote, your brother taught me to listen differently, to hear what others miss. A valuable teaching, Morningstar acknowledged. One our people have carried it for generations, though few whites have ears to receive it. She studied Kat thoughtfully. Yet you heard, a rare gift. Swift Eagle's expression revealed quiet pride in this exchange between his sister and the child who had become so unexpectedly important in his life. Catherine faces her own choices about paths forward, he observed. The white woman speaks of a school where both traditions might be honored, a place between worlds. Morningstar considered this with the wisdom of one who had navigated cultural boundaries long before current conflicts. Such places are few, she said finally, but precious when they exist, seeds that might grow into different future if tended carefully. She turned to Kat directly. What does your heart tell you, Sean, beyond what others expect or suggest? It was a profound question that cut through external considerations to core truth. Kat took her time responding, searching for honesty rather than mere convenience or obligation. After careful consideration, she wrote, cannot return to what was, cannot pretend massacre never happened, but want to build something from ashes, something that honors both families lost. Morningstar nodded, seemingly satisfied with this response. The best memorial for those who have walked on is not grief alone, but new growth that carries their spirit forward. Swift Eagle added his own perspective. The school Elizabeth Wilson describes might become such growth if approached with clear eyes about difficulties ahead. The path between worlds is never easy one. Kat acknowledged this reality with a solemn nod. She had no illusions about the challenges such a choice would entail: resistance from those who preferred separation to integration, skepticism from both communities about attempts to honor diverse traditions, personal struggles as she continued navigating her own complex identity. Yet the alternative, returning to conventional life, as if wilderness had not transformed her, or attempting full adoption of Cheyenne ways despite increasing pressures on their traditional existence, seemed equally problematic, requiring denial of essential aspects of who she had become. On her slate, she wrote a question that had lingered since their rescue: will you return to your people when healing complete? Swift Eagle exchanged glances with Morningstar before responding. For now, yes. Our people need to know what happened. Truth behind attacks blamed on whites, truth behind white attacks blamed on us. They must prepare for challenges coming as territory changes. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. But paths cross again, I think. Your journey and mine not finished with each other. The simple statement carried profound reassurance, acknowledgement that bonds formed through shared survival and purpose transcended immediate circumstances, that separation need not mean severance of connection. As twilight settled over Helena, casting long shadows across Judge Wilson's garden, Kat found unexpected peace in this uncertainty. The future remained unwritten paths forward, not fully illuminated. Yet she was no longer the frightened child hiding beneath a fallen pine, no longer the isolated ghost haunting mountain wilderness. She had found her way back to human community, without surrendering what wilderness had taught her, had regained purpose without denying trauma's reality, had discovered new family connections while honoring those irretrievably lost. Swift Eagle had once told her that boundary crossers held special value in his tradition. Those who could stand at the edge of the circle, seeing both inside and outside, translating between worlds that struggled to understand each other. Perhaps that was her destiny, not by birth, but by circumstance and choice to embody integration, where others saw only division to find harmony, where others heard only discord. As darkness finally claimed the garden, stars appearing overhead like distant witnesses to human struggles below, Kat withdrew her father's flute from its constant place in her pocket. Swift Eagle nodded encouragement, and she began to play softly at first, then with growing confidence. The melody was neither purely European nor traditionally Cheyenne, but something new that partook of both traditions. Her father's classical training merged with Swift Eagle's natural harmonies, wilderness rhythms, complementing structured phrases, grief and hope intertwined in complex counterpoint. Morningstar closed her eyes, listening with complete attention. "The voice you found," she murmured when Kat finally lowered the instrument. "Different from words yet speaking clearly." Swift Eagle nodded agreement. "Some truths need new language to be fully heard. You have begun creating such language, Catherine Sullivan. Where it leads, who can say, but worthy journey, I think." As they returned indoors to the warmth and light of Judge Wilson's home, Kat carried this assessment like a promise not of specific destination, but of meaningful direction. Not of certainty, but of purpose that transcended circumstance. The wilderness had taken her voice but given her music, had claimed her family but offered new connections, had stripped away civilization's protections but revealed strengths she hadn't known she possessed. Whatever came next, testimony at trials that would expose conspiracy and bring justice, educational ventures that might bridge cultural divides, ongoing navigation of her complex identity as survivor and boundary crosser, Catherine Sullivan would face it with the resilience forged through solitude and the wisdom gained through unexpected alliance. She would then, and would remain, a voice of the wilderness, speaking not despite silence, but through it carrying memory, not as burden, but as foundation for whatever new harmony might yet be created from tragedy's discord. That voice in all its forms would not be silenced again. "Brought your dinner," she said, setting the tray on a small table. "And Captain Campbell asked me to inform you that the reconnaissance force will depart at first light tomorrow." Kat nodded acknowledgement, but her expression must have betrayed her frustration at being left behind, for Sarah's features softened with sympathy. "I know you want to go with them," she said, settling into the room's single chair. "But Commander Harding is right, it's too dangerous. Captain Campbell is taking our best men. If your friends can be found, they will find them." Friends. The word struck Kat with unexpected force. Was that what Swift Eagle and Morningstar had become to her? The concept seemed simultaneously inadequate and profound. Swift Eagle was her teacher, her protector, the bridge between her lost family and whatever future awaited her. More than friend, less than father, a category of relationship for which she had no ready name. Sarah studied her with quiet interest. "Dr. Bennett, my father says you've been living wild for months, that you survived alone in the mountains after your family was killed." Kat nodded, unused to having her story acknowledged so directly after months of solitary existence. "That's remarkable." Sarah's tone held genuine admiration rather than pity. "Most grown men wouldn't have lasted a week, let alone through winter." Kat shrugged, slightly uncomfortable with praise for what had been simple necessity. Survival hadn't been a choice, but an instinct, a refusal to surrender that owed more to stubborn persistence than heroic fortitude. Sarah seemed to understand her discomfort, changing the subject smoothly. "Father also mentioned you can't speak or choose not to. Either way, he thought this might help." She withdrew a small slate and chalk from her apron pocket, offering them to Kat. "For when you need to communicate more than yes or no." Kat accepted the gift with genuine gratitude, and immediately writing, "Thank you." "You're welcome," Sarah smiled. "I should let you eat while it's hot. If you need anything, just knock on the wall. My quarters are next door." After Sarah departed, Kat approached the meal with cautious appreciation. The stew was richer than anything she had eaten in months, the bread a luxury almost forgotten. She consumed both, slowly savoring textures and flavors that transported her briefly back to her mother's kitchen in Boston, to family dinners around a table worn smooth by generations of use. The memory brought a sharp pang of grief, but not the overwhelming despair that had once accompanied such recollections. Something had shifted within her during her time with Swift Eagle, not a diminishment of loss, but a change in how she carried it. Perhaps it was the sharing a burden with someone who truly understood, or perhaps simply the passage of time working its gradual healing. When she had finished eating, Kat moved to the small window that overlooked the fort's central grounds. Twilight had settled over the compound lanterns, casting pools of yellow light at regular intervals along the walkways. Soldiers moved with purpose between buildings, preparations for tomorrow's mission evident in their focused activity. Among them, Kat spotted Captain Campbell conferring with a small group of men scouts or trackers, judging by their less formal attire and the practical equipment they carried. She watched as they studied what appeared to be maps, Campbell gesturing toward the western mountains where Wade's camp lay hidden. The sight stirred both hope and anxiety within her. These men represented Swift Eagle's best chance for rescue, yet they were strangers operating from limited information. Would they recognize the subtle signs that marked the camp's approach? Would they understand the need for absolute stealth when dealing with Wade's experienced killers? Would they value a Cheyenne prisoner's life as highly as their military objectives? Kat's hand rose unconsciously to touch Swift Eagle's bone whistle, still hanging from its cord around her neck. In the wilderness, this simple object had represented connection and protection. Here, surrounded by the trappings of military power, it served as a different kind of talisman, a reminder of promises made and debts owed, of a world beyond fort walls where survival depended on harmony with nature rather than dominion over it. As darkness claimed the compound, Kat returned to her bed, stretching out on its unfamiliar softness. Sleep seemed an unlikely visitor, her mind too crowded with concerns for Swift Eagle's fate and uncertainties about her own future. Yet the past day's exertions had taken their toll, and eventually exhaustion overcame anxiety. Her last conscious thought was a wordless hope carried on the wings of dreams that wherever Swift Eagle was, he would know she had not abandoned him. That the evidence they had risked everything to obtain was now in hands that might use it for justice. That their separation was temporary rather than permanent. A hope that, like music played in the wilderness, might somehow transcend physical distance to reach its intended recipient. Morning arrived with the rhythmic beat of drums calling the fort to wakefulness. Kat had been awake long before, unable to rest deeply in such unfamiliar surroundings. She dressed quickly in the clothes Sarah had provided, simple but sturdy garments that felt strangely constraining after months in her adapted wilderness attire. A knock at her door announced Sarah's arrival with breakfast, cornmeal porridge, dried fruit, and coffee that Kat approached with cautious curiosity, having only vague memories of its taste from her life before the massacre. "The reconnaissance force is preparing to depart," Sarah informed her as Kat ate. "Captain Campbell asked if you might provide any final information that could aid their search." Kat nodded, finishing her meal quickly before retrieving the slate. In careful script, she detailed what she recalled of the camp's layout, the positioning of guards, and the building where she believed prisoners might be held. She added a warning about Wade's likely response to their earlier escape, increased vigilance, possible relocation of valuable prisoners, perhaps even abandonment of the camp entirely if he suspected military involvement. Sarah delivered this information to Campbell, returning a short time later to escort Kat to the fort's main gate, where the reconnaissance force had assembled. 12 men composed the party, Campbell himself, 2 regular Army scouts, and 9 soldiers selected for their frontier experience and combat skills. They were mounted on the fort's best horses, equipped for rapid travel and potential conflict. Campbell approached Kat as final preparations were made, his expression reflecting both determination and cautious optimism. "We'll find your friends if they're still at the camp," he assured her, "and we'll be alert for any signs of them if Wade has moved his operation." Kat nodded gratefully, then impulsively reached for her slate writing, "Swift Eagle knows bird calls, will recognize chickadee as friendly signal." Campbell read this with interest. "Useful information. Thank you." He studied her face for a moment, seeming to recognize the depth of her concern beneath her composed exterior. "You've shown remarkable courage throughout this ordeal, Miss Sullivan. Rest assured we'll exercise the same determination in this mission." With that, he rejoined his men, and moments later the reconnaissance force departed, hooves thundering against the packed earth as they passed through the fort's gates and turned westward toward the mountains. Kat watched until they disappeared from sight, acutely aware of her own enforced inactivity. After months of constant movement and vigilance, after days of purposeful journey with Swift Eagle, this stillness felt unnatural, almost painful in its constraint. Sarah, perhaps sensing her restlessness, suggested a tour of the fort to pass the time. It might help to understand more about where you are, she offered, and walking often settles an anxious mind. Kat accepted with a nod, following Sarah through the compound's orderly pathways. The fort was larger than it had appeared on her arrival, comprising not just military buildings, but supporting structures that made it a nearly self-sufficient community: a blacksmith's forge carpentry shop, laundry bakery, and small infirmary where Dr. Bennett worked. It was at this last location that they paused longest, Sarah explaining her father's role as the fort's physician and her own position as his assistant. "Father trained at Harvard Medical School," she said with evident pride. "He could have had a prestigious practice in Boston or Philadelphia, but he chose to come west where medical care was scarcer." The mention of Boston stirred Kat's interest. On her slate, she wrote, "I'm from Boston." "Are you really?" Sarah's expression brightened. "What a coincidence, we lived on Beacon Hill before coming west. Father practiced there for 15 years. Kat wrote again, "Sullivan family. Father taught music at conservatory." Sarah's eyes widened with recognition. "Michael Sullivan, the composer and theorist." Kat nodded, surprised and oddly moved that someone in this distant place knew of her father's work. "Father attended his lecture series on harmonic theory," Sarah exclaimed. "He always said Professor Sullivan understood music as both science and art." Her expression softened. "I'm so sorry about what happened to your family, Catherine. Truly." The simple, genuine acknowledgement of her loss, free from the awkward pity or morbid curiosity that often accompanied such expressions, touched something deep within Kat. She found herself blinking back unexpected tears, nodding once in acceptance of the condolence. Sarah allowed a respectful moment to pass before continuing their tour, guiding Kat next to the fort's small chapel, a modest structure that served multiple faiths depending on which chaplain was visiting. "It's peaceful here," Sarah observed as they entered the empty building. "Sometimes I come just to sit in the quiet." Kat could understand the appeal. Despite its military functionality, the chapel possessed a serenity absent from the fort's other structures, a quality of stillness that reminded her oddly enough of certain places in the wildernesses where the land itself seemed to hush in reverence. As they settled briefly into a pew, Sarah spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "Father says you've been living with a Cheyenne healer, that he taught you their ways of survival." Kat nodded, then wrote on her slate, "Swift Eagle. Saved my life. Taught me music when words failed." Music, Sarah's interest was evident. "What kind?" In response, Kat withdrew her father's flute from the pocket where she had kept it close since arriving at the fort. She held it carefully, running her fingers over its familiar surface. "May I hear?" Sarah asked softly. "If you're comfortable playing here." Kat hesitated only briefly before raising the flute to her lips. The chapel's acoustics enhanced the instrument's voice as she played a simple melody, not her father's European compositions, but one of Swift Eagle's healing songs, its phrases rising and falling like wind through mountain pines. The music filled the small space, transforming it momentarily from a human construction into something that partook of both worlds Kat had inhabited, the civilized and the wild, the structured and the free. In that moment, through that song, she felt closer to Swift Eagle, despite the miles between them, as if the music itself might carry her concern to wherever he was being held. When the final note faded, Sarah remained silent for several heartbeats, respect evident in her expression. "That was beautiful," she said finally. "Different from classical compositions, but with its own complexity and meaning." Kat nodded, returning the flute to her pocket. On her slate, she wrote, "Swift Eagle says music speaks when words cannot." "A wise perspective," Sarah replied. "And true, I think. Music can express what lies beyond language." She studied Kat with newfound understanding. "Is that how you've managed using music instead of speech?" Kat considered this question thoughtfully before writing, "Music and listening, hearing what others miss. Your father's influence, perhaps the musician's trained ear." Kat hadn't considered this connection before, but recognized its truth immediately. Her father's insistence on developing true listening had shaped her perception long before the massacre stole her voice. What had begun as musical training had evolved into a survival skill, then transformed again into something more profound, a way of experiencing the world in all its complex harmonies and dissonances. Their conversation was interrupted by the chapel door opening to admit Dr. Bennett, a tall, dignified man with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that immediately reminded Kat of her own father. "There you are," he said to Sarah. "Commander Harding has called a meeting regarding Miss Sullivan's situation. He's requested our presence and hers if she feels well enough to attend." Kat straightened immediately, alert. On her slate, she wrote the news of Swift Eagle. Dr. Bennett shook his head. "The reconnaissance force hasn't returned or sent messengers. This concerns other developments, potentially significant ones." Kat rose without hesitation, her expression making clear her readiness to participate. Whatever these developments might be, they affected her future and possibly Swift Eagle's as well. She would not remain ignorant of decisions made on their behalf. Dr. Bennett led them to the headquarters building, where Commander Harding's aide escorted them directly to a conference room rather than the commander's private office. Inside, they found Harding himself, his adjutant, Lieutenant Reynolds, and two unexpected visitors, a distinguished-looking man in civilian clothes and a younger woman whose composed demeanor suggested education and social standing. "Ah, Dr. Bennett, Miss Bennett, and Miss Sullivan." Harding gestured toward chairs arranged around a large table. "Please join us. We have matters of some importance to discuss." Once they were seated, Harding introduced the visitors. "This is Judge Wilson from Helena, the Territorial Circuit Judge. And this is his daughter, Miss Elizabeth Wilson. They've traveled here specifically regarding the evidence you provided, Miss Sullivan." Judge Wilson inclined his head respectfully toward Kat. "Commander Harding has shared the remarkable circumstances of your survival and the evidence you've brought to light. I must say, young lady, you have demonstrated extraordinary courage and resourcefulness." Kat acknowledged this with a slight nod, her attention focused more on understanding why a territorial judge would travel personally to Fort Ellis rather than simply receiving reports through official channels. As if reading her question, Wilson continued, "I've come because the documents you recovered implicate officials at the highest level of territorial government. Such accusations require the most careful and discreet handling to ensure justice is properly served." He opened a portfolio that lay before him, removing several of the papers Kat had taken from Wade's office. "These records detail a conspiracy of exceptional scope, orchestrated attacks designed to foment conflict between settlers and native peoples, all to facilitate land seizures for mining interests. The territorial governor himself appears complicit, along with Colonel Blackwood and several other officials." Wilson's expression grew grave. "In my 20 years as a jurist, I've seen corruption in many forms, but rarely anything this systematic or deadly. It represents a profound betrayal of public trust and violation of treaty obligations to the Cheyenne Nation." Kat appreciated his evident moral clarity, but remained uncertain about the practical implications. She wrote on her slate, "What happens now?" "An excellent question," Wilson replied. "Normally, such evidence would trigger immediate arrests and a formal inquiry. However, the involvement of the governor complicates matters significantly. He controls the territorial militia and influences military assignments. Moving against him prematurely could result in evidence disappearing, witnesses being silenced, and justice ultimately denied." He leaned forward, his manner becoming more direct. "Which brings me to why I've come in person, Miss Sullivan. Your testimony, what you witnessed at the massacre site and later observed at Wade's camp, is crucial to establishing the full scope of these crimes. Without it, the documentary evidence, while compelling, might be dismissed as forgeries or misinterpretations." The implication was clear. Kat's role had expanded from delivering evidence to becoming evidence herself, her experiences and observations now central to any hope of justice. Commander Harding spoke next, his tone measured but firm. "Judge Wilson and I agree that your safety must be our paramount concern. If Wade or Blackwood learned of your presence here, they would stop at nothing to prevent your testimony." Kat's response was immediate and emphatic. On her slate, she wrote in large letters, "Not leaving without Swift Eagle. We understand your loyalty to the Cheyenne man who helped you." Harding acknowledged, "Captain Campbell's mission has that rescue as its primary objective. But we must also consider contingencies if that attempt fails." Judge Wilson nodded agreement. "The judicial proceedings I envision will take time to arrange. Federal authorities must be notified, independent military personnel brought in to secure arrests, witnesses assembled. During this preparation period, you would be most vulnerable." His daughter Elizabeth spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the refined accent of Eastern education tempered with frontier practicality. Father and I have discussed this at length, Miss Sullivan. We believe the safest course would be for you to accompany us back to our home outside Helena. It's remote enough to avoid casual discovery, but close enough to the territorial capital for quick access when your testimony is required. She smiled slightly, a warm expression that softened her otherwise reserved demeanor. I've taught at girls' schools in Boston and Philadelphia. I could continue your education during this interim period, helping you readjust to conventional life. The offer was clearly well-intentioned, yet Kat felt an immediate resistance to the underlying assumption that her wilderness existence represented merely an unfortunate detour from proper civilization, a condition to be remedied rather than an experience that had fundamentally shaped who she now was. Before she could respond, Dr. Bennett entered the conversation with gentle authority. If I may, there's a medical consideration as well. Miss Sullivan has experienced severe trauma, both from witnessing her family's murder and from months of isolation. Her muteness appears psychological rather than physical in origin. He glanced at Kat with a brief apologetic smile for discussing her condition so directly. Stability and specialized care might help address this condition. In Helena, she could consult with colleagues of mine who have experience treating similar cases. Kat felt a flicker of irritation at this clinical assessment of her silence. She had adapted to life without speech, had found alternative means of expression through music and gesture. Her muteness was not a defect requiring correction, but a reality she had integrated into her identity. She wrote on her slate, "My voice not important now, justice for families killed, safety for Jenkins settlement, freedom for Swift Eagle and Morning Star." Judge Wilson read her words with evident respect. "Your priorities do you credit, Miss Sullivan. And I assure you, justice for all victims of this conspiracy is precisely our goal." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But consider this, your testimony will be most powerful if delivered in your own voice. A jury or military tribunal will be more deeply moved by spoken words than by written statements." It was a pragmatic observation, one that Kat couldn't entirely dismiss. Yet the implied pressure to recover her speech for others' convenience, rather than her own healing, felt uncomfortably manipulative. Elizabeth Wilson, perhaps sensing Kat's discomfort, offered a compromise. "Why don't we defer any decisions until Captain Campbell returns? If your friends are rescued, that would significantly change the considerations at hand." Commander Harding nodded agreement. "A sensible approach. Campbell should return within 3 days, successful or not. Until then, Miss Sullivan remains under fort protection." The meeting concluded with this temporary resolution, leaving Kat with mixed emotions as she returned to her quarters. The involvement of a respected judge suggested the evidence might indeed lead to justice, yet the discussions of her future, conducted largely around her rather than with her, highlighted her ambiguous status as both crucial witness and vulnerable child. Sarah accompanied her back to her room, maintaining a thoughtful silence until they were alone. "You're not happy with their plans for you," she observed then, her perception acute. Kat shook her head, writing, "They see only what I was not, what I've become." Sarah considered this insight. Perhaps because it's easier for adults to imagine returning you to a familiar category, traumatized child, than to acknowledge you have grown into someone more complex through your experiences. The assessment was surprisingly perceptive, acknowledging Kat's transformation in a way the others had not. She wrote, "You understand." "Perhaps because I've experienced something similar, though less dramatic," Sarah replied. "When we first came west, people constantly referred to what I'd given up in Boston as if my identity could only be defined by its relationship to civilization, not by what I'd gained in this new place." She settled into the room's chair, her expression thoughtful. "The truth is, Catherine, you've lived through experiences few can comprehend. You've developed skills and perspectives that don't fit neatly into conventional expectations. That makes people uncomfortable, even well-meaning people like my father and Judge Wilson." Kat nodded, grateful for this understanding. On her slate, she wrote, "Swift Eagle never saw me as broken, saw strength instead. And that's why you won't leave without him," Sarah concluded softly. "He recognizes who you've become, while others see only who you were." The simple truth of this observation brought unexpected tears to Kat's eyes. Swift Eagle had never once suggested her silence was a condition to overcome or her wilderness adaptation something to outgrow. He had met her exactly where she was, offering guidance without judgment, support without condescension. Sarah reached out briefly, squeezing Kat's hand in silent sympathy. "Rest now," she advised. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, and perhaps news of your friends as well." After Sarah departed, Kat moved to the window, gazing westward toward the mountains where Swift Eagle might still be held captive. The bone whistle felt heavy against her chest, a physical reminder of promises made and bonds formed that transcended conventional relationships. Whatever plans others might make for her future, Kat knew one truth with absolute certainty: she would not abandon Swift Eagle to his fate. She had not survived 6 months of the wilderness. Solitude had not risked everything to obtain evidence of Wade's crimes merely to return to a diminished version of her former life. The girl she had been had died in the massacre alongside her family. The person who emerged from that tragedy, forged by grief, solitude, and Swift Eagle's teachings, would make her own choices about what came next. And those choices would honor the debt she owed, not the expectations others held. 2 days passed with agonizing slowness, each hour stretching Kat's patience thinner as she waited for news of Campbell's mission. She maintained outward composure, participating in the routines established for her meals with Sarah, brief medical examinations by Dr. Bennett, occasional visits from Elizabeth Wilson, who seemed genuinely interested in understanding Kat's experiences rather than simply planning her rehabilitation. But beneath this compliant exterior, Kat's mind remained fixed on Swift Eagle's fate and her own uncertain future. She found small ways to prepare for various contingencies, memorizing the fort's layout and guard rotations, noting which horses in the stable seemed strongest, observing which soldiers might be sympathetic to her concerns versus those who viewed her merely as a curiosity or burden. On the morning of the third day, a sentry's call announced riders approaching from the west. Kat was in the infirmary with Sarah, learning about medicinal herbs that complemented her mother's teachings and Swift Eagle's knowledge when the news reached them. Both immediately abandoned their work, hurrying to the fort's main gate where a crowd had already gathered. Commander Harding stood at the forefront, Judge Wilson beside him, as the riders came into clear view on the plain beyond the fort. Even at a distance, Kat could count only 8 mounted figures returning from the original 12-man party. Her heart constricted with worry, not just for Swift Eagle, but for Captain Campbell and his men, who had risked themselves partly on her behalf. As the riders drew closer, she strained to see if any additional figures accompanied them, perhaps Swift Eagle or Morning Star riding double with the soldiers. But no such hopeful sight materialized. The returning party consisted only of Campbell's men, some showing visible signs of combat, bandaged limbs, torn uniforms, the exhausted posture of those who had faced death and emerged changed by the encounter. The gates swung open to admit them, and Commander Harding stepped forward to meet Campbell, who dismounted stiffly, his uniform stained with dust and what appeared to be dried blood. "Report, Captain," Harding ordered, though his tone carried concern beneath its military crispness. Campbell saluted despite his evident fatigue. "Sir, we located Wade's camp as directed, found it heavily guarded, more men than anticipated, positioned as if expecting trouble." Kat pushed closer, desperate to hear every detail, Sarah making way for her through the gathered soldiers. "We established observation posts and confirmed the camp layout matched Miss Sullivan's description," Campbell continued. "At nightfall, we attempted a covert approach to locate the prisoners. That's when things went wrong." He grimaced, touching a bandaged wound on his shoulder. "They had additional sentries hidden in the surrounding forest professionals, not the usual camp guards. We engaged them when discovery was inevitable, but the alarm was raised." "Casualties?" Harding asked grimly. "Thompson and Rodriguez killed in the initial exchange. Martinez critically wounded. We left him with a local settler family who agreed to care for him. Simmons missing, presumed captured." Kat's heart sank further with each word. The mission had clearly been a disaster, with good men lost and apparently no success in locating Swift Eagle or Morning Star. But Campbell wasn't finished. "We were forced to retreat under heavy fire, sir. That's when we witnessed something unexpected. The entire camp mobilized for departure wagons, loaded horses saddled. They're abandoning the location, presumably heading for a secondary position." Harding's expression darkened. "They know we're on to them. This complicates matters significantly." "There's more, sir." Campbell hesitated, glancing at Kat. Before we were driven off, we confirmed the presence of Cheyenne prisoners in the camp. At least one man matching Swift Eagle's description and an older woman. Kat's surge of hope at this confirmation was immediately tempered by the realization that Swift Eagle remained in Wade's hands, and now Wade was moving, taking his captives to an unknown location where rescue would become even more difficult. We tracked their initial direction before breaking off to return here, Campbell added. They're heading north, possibly toward the Canadian border. This new information sent a ripple of concern through the gathered officers. The border represented a significant complication beyond it. American military authority ended, and pursuit would become a diplomatic matter rather than a straightforward operation. Judge Wilson stepped forward. This changes our calculation considerably. If Wade is fleeing with his prisoners, we must act more decisively than planned. Harding nodded agreement. I'll dispatch a larger force immediately if we can intercept them before they reach the border. With respect, Commander, Campbell interrupted. A military column would be seen for miles in that open country. Wade has scouts watching all approaches. He'd simply change course or increase pace. What do you suggest, Captain? Harding asked, recognizing the validity of this concern. A smaller party might succeed where a larger force would fail. 4 or 5 experienced men traveling light could move faster and with greater stealth. If they overtook Wade's group at night, they might yet free the prisoners. Kat listened intently, her mind already racing ahead of the conversation. A small rescue party was exactly what the situation demanded, but Campbell hadn't mentioned the most crucial factor in any such attempt. She pushed forward until she stood directly before Harding and Campbell, slate in hand. In bold letters she wrote, "I must go with them." Harding's immediate response was predictable. Absolutely not. This is a military operation, not a place for civilians, let alone a child. Kat erased her slate and wrote again, "I know Swift Eagle. He knows me. He will trust my signal, not strangers." Before Harding could dismiss this argument, Campbell intervened thoughtfully. "She has a point, sir. When we approached their camp, we attempted the bird call signal Miss Sullivan suggested, but received no response. Either Swift Eagle didn't hear it, or more likely didn't trust it coming from unknown voices." He turned to Kat with newfound respect. "You believe he would respond to you even after days of captivity and possible mistreatment?" Kat nodded emphatically, writing, "He taught me Cheyenne signals. Private ones Wade wouldn't know." Campbell considered this information carefully. "Sir, if she's right, her presence could be the difference between success and failure. Without a way to signal Swift Eagle that we're allies rather than threats, any rescue attempt might simply put the prisoners at greater risk." Harding's expression remained deeply skeptical. "You're suggesting we bring a child, a traumatized mute child, on a dangerous pursuit of armed killers. The risk is unacceptable." "So it's abandoning the only witnesses who can testify to Wade's disguised attacks," Judge Wilson interjected unexpectedly. "The Cheyenne man and his sister are crucial to establishing that Wade's men impersonated native warriors. Without their testimony, half our case collapses." This practical judicial perspective seemed to give Harding pause. He studied Kat with narrowed eyes, reassessing her not merely as a child to be protected, but as an asset in a complex operation. "Even if I were to consider this," he said finally, "there would need to be absolute guarantees of Miss Sullivan's safety. She would remain well behind any actual engagement, under constant protection." Kat accepted these conditions with a quick nod, recognizing that compromise was necessary to achieve her primary goal, participation in Swift Eagle's rescue. The details could be negotiated once the principle was established. Captain Campbell, sensing the commander wavering, pressed the advantage. "I would personally ensure her safety, sir, and I believe the potential benefit outweighs the risk, especially given what's at stake." A tense silence followed as Harding weighed these arguments against his clear reluctance to endanger a child under his protection. Finally, he turned to Judge Wilson. "Your legal opinion, Judge. If harm came to Miss Sullivan during this operation, where would responsibility lie?" Wilson considered this carefully. "The legal doctrine of necessity would apply, I believe. Given the extraordinary circumstances, witnesses endanger criminals fleeing justice, evidence at risk, reasonable measures to secure testimony would be justified provided all possible precautions were taken." He glanced at Kat with unexpected empathy. "Moreover, Miss Sullivan has demonstrated exceptional resourcefulness and courage throughout this affair. Her age does not negate her agency in matters directly affecting her future. This acknowledgement of her right to participation rather than mere protection resonated deeply with Kat. For the first time since arriving at Fort Ellis, she felt seen as a person with valid perspective rather than simply a victim requiring care. Harding sighed heavily, recognizing he was outnumbered. Very well. Captain Campbell, you will assemble a small rescue party as suggested. Miss Sullivan may accompany you, but only under the strictest protective protocols. She remains at base camp during any engagement, under guard at all times. He fixed Campbell with a stern gaze. Her safety is your personal responsibility, Captain. I expect her return to this fort unharmed, regardless of the mission's outcome. Is that understood? Perfectly, sir, Campbell replied, his tone leaving no doubt about his acceptance of this duty. Then make your preparations. You depart at first light tomorrow. Harding turned to his adjutant. Lieutenant Reynolds, see to it that appropriate supplies are allocated for this mission. As the gathering dispersed, Sarah approached Kat, concern evident in her expression. Are you certain about this? Following armed men into the wilderness is dangerous even under the best circumstances. Kat's response was immediate and definitive. I owe Swift Eagle my life. Cannot abandon him. Sarah studied her face, then nodded slowly. I understand loyalty, Catherine. Just promise you'll exercise caution. There are people here who have come to care about your welfare too. The simple statement caught Kat by surprise, the recognition that in just a few days she had formed connections at Fort Ellis that transcended her status as protected witness. Sarah's friendship, Dr. Bennett's concerned care, even Elizabeth Wilson's thoughtful interest, these were tentative threads binding her back to human community after months of isolation. Yet they paled beside the profound bond forged with Swift Eagle through shared danger and purpose. He had found her when she was truly lost, had taught her to survive, not just physically, but spiritually, had treated her silence as adaptation rather than deficiency. His captivity was in part the price he had paid for ensuring her escape with the evidence. Such a debt could not remain unpaid. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever future others might envision for her, Kat's immediate path was clear northward, following Wade's trail, carrying Swift Eagle's whistle as both promise and summons. The rest would unfold as it must, one step at a time. Dawn painted the eastern sky in streaks of flame as the rescue party assembled at Fort Ellis's main gate. Captain Campbell had selected his team with care, 4 experienced soldiers with frontier backgrounds, each chosen for specific skills: Martinez for tracking, Reynolds for marksmanship, Jackson for his knowledge of the Northern Territories, and Thompson for his medical training. All were volunteers understanding the dangers they faced in pursuing Wade's band. Kat arrived dressed in a practical compromise between military utility and her own wilderness experience. Sturdy trousers, a warm shirt, and jacket and boots properly sized for her small feet. She carried minimal personal possessions, her father's flute, her journal, and Swift Eagle's bone whistle now secured more firmly on a leather cord. Commander Harding delivered final instructions to Campbell, while Judge Wilson spoke briefly with Kat, his manner solemn but respectful. Remember your promise to remain with the base camp during any engagement, he reminded her. Your role is communication with Swift Eagle, not combat with Wade's men. Kat nodded her agreement, having already accepted these terms as the price of participation. On her slate, she wrote, "What if Wade crosses border?" Wilson's expression tightened. Captain Campbell's authority ends at the international boundary. Beyond that, pursuit becomes diplomatically complex. He hesitated, then added more quietly, "However, I understand that borders appear quite different when viewed from the wilderness rather than from government offices. Captain Campbell is a practical man. He will make appropriate judgments based on circumstances." The oblique statement carried clear subtext. Official limitations might be interpreted flexibly when justice and lives were at stake. It was a surprising perspective from a territorial judge, suggesting Wilson's commitment to justice transcended strict legalism. Sarah approached next, offering Kat a small package. "Medicinal supplies," she explained, "basic treatments for injuries or illness. And this," she pressed a folded paper into Kat's hand, "a letter of introduction to a friend who operates a trading post near the northern border. If you need help, Thomas Blackwood can be trusted." Kat accepted both gifts, gratefully tucking them securely into her pack. The unexpected support from these recent acquaintances' practical aid, rather than just concern, reinforced her growing sense that human connection remained possible even after all she had lost. Final preparations completed, Campbell gave the order to mount up. A soldier helped Kat onto a smaller horse, selected specifically for her gentle but sure-footed, well-suited to a young rider. The animal's steady presence beneath her evoked memories of occasional rides during the wagon train journey, her father's supportive hand on her back as she learned to balance and guide her mount. With a final salute to Commander Harding, Campbell led their small party through the fort's gates and onto the open plain beyond. They moved at a steady pace rather than a gallop, conserving the horse's strength for what might be an extended pursuit. Campbell had estimated at least 2 days' travel to intercept Wade's group, assuming their intelligence on his direction remained accurate. As Fort Ellis receded behind them, they had experienced a profound sense of rightness, of returning to the open spaces and natural rhythms that had become more familiar to her than human settlements. The constraints of the fort had chafed more than she had acknowledged its rigid structures and schedules, at odds with the fluid adaptability she had developed in the wilderness. Their route took them northwest, following the path of a river valley before turning more directly north toward the territories that eventually merged with British Canada. The landscape gradually transformed around them, rolling plains giving way to scattered woodlands, gentle hills rising toward more dramatic terrain in the distance. Campbell maintained a vigilant pace, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses or verify their direction. He consulted frequently with Martinez, the tracker, who studied the land with expert attention for signs of Wade's passing. Occasionally, they encountered evidence, abandoned campsites, distinctive hoof prints, discarded items that suggested a larger group traveling in haste. Kat contributed to these tracking efforts in unexpected ways, her wilderness-honed senses often detecting subtle indicators the others overlooked, disturbed bird patterns, suggesting recent human passage, broken vegetation that revealed the width of a wagon's path, even the faint scent of wood smoke lingering in sheltered valleys. Campbell observed these contributions with growing respect, gradually adjusting his treatment of Kat from protected charge to valued member of their party. He began consulting her directly when trail signs became ambiguous, acknowledging her insights without condescension. By evening of the first day, they had covered significant ground, but Campbell called a halt before darkness made travel dangerous. They established a small camp in a sheltered hollow building, only a minimal fire that would not be visible from a distance. As they shared a simple meal of travel rations, Campbell outlined his developing strategy. Based on their trail, Wade's group is moving steadily but not frantically. They likely believe they've established enough lead to avoid immediate pursuit. He spread a rough map on the ground between them. If they maintain their current direction and pace, we should overtake them somewhere in this region. He indicated an area perhaps 30 miles ahead before they reach the border. Kat studied the map with interest, noting that the terrain ahead featured more varied topography, hills, forested areas, and several river crossings that might slow Wade's wagons and create opportunities for interception. On her slate, she wrote how many in Wade's group. Martinez estimates 12 to 15 men based on trail signs, Campbell replied, plus the prisoners and whatever equipment they're transporting. Thompson, the medic, frowned thoughtfully. Those are challenging odds, even with surprise on our side, which is why stealth and precision will be essential, Campbell emphasized. Our objective is extracting the prisoners, not engaging Wade's entire force. If Miss Sullivan can signal the Cheyenne man and establish trust, we may be able to coordinate a rescue without a direct confrontation. This approach aligned perfectly with Kat's priorities. Swift Eagle's safety mattered more than Wade's capture, justice for the dead, more than vengeance against their killers. She wrote, Swift Eagle will help if he can. Warrior skills, Campbell nodded. I'm counting on that. An ally inside their camp would significantly improve our chances. As night settled fully around them, watches were established, 2 men alert at all times while others rested. Despite the day's exertions, Kat found sleep elusive, her mind filled with concern for Swift Eagle's condition and the challenges that lay ahead. The wilderness sounds surrounding their camp. Owl calls the rustle of night creatures, wind through grass, provided familiar comfort. Yet she remained acutely aware of the human dangers they pursued. When her restlessness became too pronounced, she rose quietly and moved to sit beside Jackson, who held the current watch. The older soldier acknowledged her with a nod, respecting her apparent desire for silence rather than conversation. Together they gazed out into the star-filled darkness, each occupied with private thoughts, yet sharing the fundamental vigilance of those who understand wilderness survival. After some time, Kat withdrew her father's flute, raising it in silent question. Jackson nodded permission, and she began to play very softly a simple melody that carried barely beyond their immediate vicinity. The music served multiple purposes, calming her anxious mind, honoring Swift Eagle's teachings about harmony with the natural world, and perhaps in some way she couldn't articulate, but nonetheless believed sending a message across the miles that separated her from her captured friend. "I'm coming," the melody seemed to say. "Hold fast, you are not forgotten." When she finished, Jackson spoke for the first time, his voice rough with age, but gentle in tone. "That's not like any music I've heard before. Not quite white, not quite Indian. Something new." Kat nodded, appreciating his perception. On her slate, she wrote two traditions meeting. "Like me now." Jackson studied her words thoughtfully. "Reckon that's true of all of us out here in our own ways. Frontier makes something different of everyone who crosses it." He gazed back toward the eastern horizon, toward the settled lands beyond. "Can't go back to what you were before, can only become something new." The simple observation carried profound insight, acknowledging what others at Fort Ellis had seemed reluctant to recognize, that Kat's transformation wasn't merely trauma to be overcome, but a fundamental reshaping of identity. She had become a boundary crosser, existing in the space between categories rather than belonging fully to any single tradition. With this recognition came a flicker of clarity about her uncertain future. Perhaps she need not choose between returning to civilization and remaining in the wilderness. Perhaps, like the music, she played European instrument, carrying Cheyenne melodies, she could forge a path that honored both aspects of her experience. But such possibilities remained distant and hypothetical. First came the immediate challenge of finding and freeing Swift Eagle and Morning Star. Everything else must wait upon that essential task. Dawn arrived with a light rain that complicated tracking, but also offered potential advantage. Reduced visibility might help conceal their approach when they finally located Wade's party. They broke camp efficiently, resuming their northward journey with increased urgency, as signs indicated their quarry was now less than half a day ahead. By mid-morning, Martinez spotted smoke rising from a sheltered valley approximately 3 miles distant, likely a campsite and too large for ordinary travelers. Campbell called a halt, using it as field glass to study the location from their elevated position. "That's them," he confirmed after careful observation. Wagons arranged in a defensive circle, men on guard, so consistent with Wade's typical setup. He passed the glass to Kat, who focused it carefully on the distant camp. The magnified image revealed details that sent her heart racing. The main wagon, where Wade likely quartered smaller structures for his men, horses corralled within the circle's protection. And near what appeared to be a supply wagon, two figures seated on the ground, their postures suggesting restraint rather than freedom of movement. Even at this distance, Kat recognized Swift Eagle's distinctive profile. He was alive, apparently unharmed enough to sit upright, though his posture suggested fatigue or injury. Beside him, an older woman could only be Morning Star, her long gray hair visible even through the glass's limited clarity. Kat lowered the instrument, hope and anxiety warring within her chest. They had found their quarry, confirmed the prisoners lived. Now came the most dangerous part of their mission, closing the distance without detection, establishing communication with Swift Eagle, and extracting both captives from under the watchful eyes of Wade's men. Campbell gathered his team for final planning. "We'll approach from the east, where that forested ridge provides cover almost to the edge of their camp. Martinez and I will scout the perimeter, identify guard positions and rotations. Jackson and Reynolds will establish firing positions on the high ground to provide cover if needed." He turned to Kat. "You'll remain with Thompson at our base position in the forest. If we confirm a viable approach, we'll bring you forward, but only to a safe distance where your signal might reach Swift Eagle. Under no circumstances do you enter the camp itself. Is that clear?" Kat nodded agreement, understanding the practical necessity of these restrictions. On her slate, she wrote, "What signal sound carries in valley?" Good point, Campbell acknowledged. A bird call might be heard by all, not just swift eagle. He considered alternatives. Is there a visual signal he would recognize? Something distinctive to you? Cat thought carefully, then wrote flute reflection. Sun on metal. Pattern he taught me. Using sunlight flash from your flute's metal fittings? Clever. Campbell nodded approval. If we can position you with proper sightlines to their position, that might work. Subtle enough to avoid general notice, but specific enough for recognition. With their approach strategy established, the rescue party advanced cautiously toward the valley, using every available feature of the landscape for concealment. They established a base position in the forest as planned, and Campbell departed with Martinez to scout the camp's perimeter, leaving Cat under Thompson's watchful protection. The waiting proved almost unbearable. Minutes stretched into an hour, then longer, with no sign of Campbell's return. Cat occupied herself by preparing her flute, polishing its metal joints to maximize reflectivity, rehearsing mentally the specific pattern of light flashes that Swift Eagle would recognize as deliberately formed rather than random reflection. When Campbell and Martinez finally returned, their expressions conveyed both concern and determination. Their security is tight, Campbell reported. Guards posted at regular intervals overlapping fields of view. They're expecting trouble. He unfolded a rough sketch of the camp he had made during observation. The prisoners are kept here near the supply wagon, 2 guards at all times, relieved every 2 hours. He indicated the eastern perimeter. There's a potential blind spot here where the ground dips slightly. If we position you just beyond that rise, you might have line of sight to Swift Eagle without being visible to the guards. It was a narrow opportunity, but the only one available. Cat nodded her understanding and readiness to attempt the signal. We'll move into position at midday, Campbell decided. Maximum sunlight for your signal, and their guard change should be happening, then creating momentary distraction. The final approach required exquisite caution, crawling the last 100 yards on stomach and elbows, using every depression in the ground for concealment. Campbell led Cat personally, Thompson following close behind, while Martinez, Jackson, and Reynolds established positions that would allow covering fire if their presence was discovered. When they reached the position Campbell had identified, he indicated Cat should advance alone the final few yards to the ridgeline, where she would have clear sight of the prisoners without exposing more than necessary of herself to potential observation. Heart-pounding, Cat inched forward until she could peer over the rise. The camp lay spread below her, perhaps 70 yards distant. From this angle, she could clearly see Swift Eagle and Morning Star seated back-to-back near the supply wagon, their hands apparently bound. 2 armed men stood nearby, occasionally glancing at their prisoners, but primarily focused outward, scanning for external threats. Swift Eagle's condition appeared better than she had feared, no visible serious injuries, though his face showed evidence of rough treatment. His posture remained proud despite his bonds, his gaze alert and evaluating rather than defeated. Morning Star appeared more physically diminished, her frame thin from captivity, but her bearing similarly unbowed. Cat withdrew slightly, positioning her flute where sunlight struck its metal fittings. With careful precision, she tilted the instrument to direct reflected flashes towards Swift Eagle's position. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short again. The pattern repeated a deliberate message rather than random glinting. For agonizing moments, there was no reaction. Cat feared the signal wasn't visible from Swift Eagle's position, or that he was too distracted by captivity to notice such a subtle communication. She was preparing to risk a more obvious signal when she saw it, Swift Eagle's head turning slightly, his posture straightening incrementally as his attention fixed on the source of the flashing light. Recognition dawned in his expression, carefully masked from his guards, but unmistakable to Cat's watchful eyes. He knew help had come. More importantly, he knew she was part of that help, that these were allies rather than new enemies. Swift Eagle made a subtle movement with his bound hands, a gesture that appeared casual to anyone not familiar with Cheyenne Sign Language, but which Cat recognized immediately: patience. Wait for darkness. She responded with another pattern of light flashes, acknowledging his message, then withdrew fully from the ridgeline to report to Campbell. On her slate, she wrote excitedly, "He saw recognized signal says wait for night." Campbell nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Good. Very good. This confirms our approach strategy." He gestured for them to retreat further back to where they could speak without risk of being overheard by the camp. Once safely beyond potential detection, Campbell outlined his developing plan. We'll wait for full darkness, then approach from multiple directions. Jackson and Reynolds will create a diversion on the western perimeter. Nothing too aggressive, just enough to draw attention and guards away from the prisoners. He turned to Martinez. You and I will approach from this eastern side using the same blind spot. If Swift Eagle is prepared for our arrival, he may be able to assist despite his bonds. To Thompson, he added, You'll remain with Miss Sullivan at a secure position approximately 200 yards back, ready to receive the prisoners once extracted. Have medical supplies prepared. They may need immediate attention. Each man acknowledged his role with quiet professionalism, the gravity of their task reflected in focused expressions and careful attention to details. As they retreated to their waiting position to prepare for nightfall, Kat found herself both heartened by their competence and anxious about the risks they were undertaking partly on her behalf. The afternoon passed with excruciating slowness, each minute crawling by as the sun arced westward. Kat occupied herself by helping Thompson prepare potential medical supplies and reviewing the route they would take once the prisoners were secured. Campbell had selected a different path for their retreat than the one they had used for approach heading northeast initially, to confuse any pursuit before turning south toward Fort Ellis. As twilight finally yielded to true darkness, the rescue party made final preparations, checking weapons, donning darker clothing to blend with the night, synchronizing timepieces to coordinate their movements. Campbell addressed them one final time before they separated for their assigned positions. Remember, our objective is extraction of the prisoners, not engagement with Wade's full force. We move quickly, quietly, and together. If something goes wrong, the rally point is the lightning-struck pine we noted on our approach. Questions? There were none. Each man understood his role and the stakes involved. Campbell turned to Kat last. Your part is done, Miss Sullivan. You've established contact, confirmed Swift Eagle's awareness of our presence. Now you must trust us to complete the mission. Kat nodded, acknowledging the necessity of remaining behind, despite her desire to participate more directly in Swift Eagle's rescue. On her slate, she wrote a final message to Campbell, bring them back safely. That's the plan, he replied simply. Then with a nod to his men, he led them forward into the darkness, leaving Kat with Thompson at their secure position to await either success or failure. The waiting proved even more agonizing than the afternoon's vigil. Kat strained her ears for any sound from the direction of the camp, knowing that success would be marked by silence, while failure would likely bring gunfire and alarm. Thompson maintained a reassuring calm beside her, his medical supplies arranged for immediate use, his rifle positioned for defense if needed. An hour passed with no clear indication of developments. Then faintly came sounds that sent a chill through Kat's body, shouts from the direction of the camp, followed by the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Multiple shots echoed across the valley, suggesting the diversion had escalated into actual conflict. Thompson tensed beside her, his expression grim but controlled. Stay calm, he advised quietly. This doesn't necessarily mean failure. Could be part of the plan. Kat nodded, though anxiety coursed through her veins like ice water. She found herself clutching Swift Eagle's bone whistle, the simple object, a talisman against fear, a connection to the man they had come to rescue. More shots sounded, then a brief silence followed by renewed gunfire, closer now, suggesting movement in their direction. Thompson shifted to a more defensive position, placing himself between Kat and the potential approach of hostiles. Be ready to retreat if I give the word, he murmured, rifle raised and ready. Your safety remains the priority. Kat ignored this instruction, her attention fixed on the darkness before them, searching for any sign of Campbell and the others. Minutes stretched with excruciating slowness, marked only by distant shouts and occasional gunfire that seemed to be moving in multiple directions, suggesting confusion or pursuit rather than coordinated action. Then, emerging from the darkness like ghosts, came figures moving swiftly toward their position, two supporting a third between them. As they drew closer, Kat's heart leapt with recognition. Martinez and Reynolds, half carrying, half dragging, Morningstar between them. Thompson rushed forward to assist, helping lower the exhausted woman to the ground, where he immediately began checking her condition. Kat approached more hesitantly, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond, searching for signs of Swift Eagle and the others. Martinez, breathing heavily from exertion, anticipated her unspoken question. Campbell and Jackson are bringing Swift Eagle. He was more heavily guarded, took longer to reach him. They're coming. Relief washed through Kat, though tempered by the knowledge that they weren't yet safe. Morningstar's condition appeared serious, but not critical: exhaustion and malnutrition rather than acute injury. The older woman looked up at Kat with confusion, clearly wondering who this strange child might be and why she was part of a rescue party. Before any explanation could be attempted, more figures materialized from the darkness. Campbell supporting Swift Eagle, whose movement seemed hampered by injury, with Jackson providing cover behind them. As they reached the relative safety of their position, Kat's heart contracted at Swift Eagle's condition. His face bruised, his gait uneven, suggesting leg injury, dried blood visible on his clothing. Yet his eyes, when they found Kat, carried unmistakable recognition, and something more: pride, perhaps, or simple joy at reunion. Despite his evident pain, Swift Eagle straightened slightly at the sight of her, nodding once in acknowledgement of all that had transpired since their separation. Campbell wasted no time on reunions. "They've discovered the escape," he reported tersely. "Full pursuit will follow once they organize. We need to move immediately." Thompson had already helped Morningstar to her feet, supporting her weight as they prepared to depart. Swift Eagle seemed determined to walk unassisted despite his injuries, though he accepted Campbell's steadying hand when necessary. As they began their retreat, moving as quickly as the rescued prisoner's condition allowed, Swift Eagle managed to position himself briefly beside Kat. His voice, when he spoke, was rough from disuse but carried familiar calm beneath the strain. "Little ghost," he greeted her simply. "You kept your promise." Kat nodded, unable to respond verbally, but conveying volumes through her expression and the gentle touch she placed on his arm: relief, concerned determination to see him safely away from danger. Swift Eagle's gaze shifted to the bone whistle she still clutched. "Its medicine worked," he observed. "Called help across the miles." Before Kat could respond, even with gesture, Campbell urged them forward more urgently. "Save reunions for safety," he advised. "Wade's men will be right behind us." The next hours passed in a blur of necessary movement, traveling by night using Jackson's knowledge of the terrain to maximum advantage, pausing only when absolutely required for the prisoner's endurance. Thompson administered what care he could during these brief rests, treating Swift Eagle's most immediate injuries and providing both captives with water and simple nourishment to restore their strength. Morningstar recovered enough during one such pause to speak briefly with her English, halting but intelligible. "My brother said a ghost child would come," she told Kat, studying her with keen eyes that missed nothing despite her physical weakness. "A spirit between worlds who heard what others could not hear." Kat accepted this description without surprise, recognizing that from the Cheyenne perspective, her wilderness existence and peculiar abilities might indeed seem supernatural. She wrote on her slate, "Not ghost, just survivor, like you." Morningstar's weathered features creased in a brief smile. "Perhaps same thing in end. Those who walk through death's shadow but do not remain there all carry spirit marks." It was an assessment that resonated with Kat's own understanding of her transformation. Not merely trauma that had damaged her, but an experience that had marked her in ways both visible and invisible, separating her irrevocably from the child she had been before. Their conversation was cut short by Campbell's order to resume movement. Dawn was approaching, and with it, increased risk of detection if Wade's men had maintained pursuit through the night. They needed to reach more defensible terrain before daylight exposed their position and limited their options. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when Jackson identified a promising location, a rocky outcropping that offered both concealment and defensible positions if pursuit caught up with them. Campbell approved the site immediately, directing his men to establish a temporary camp while maintaining vigilant watch for signs of Wade's approach. Morningstar and Swift Eagle, despite their obvious exhaustion, insisted on helping establish the camp rather than resting immediately. It was clear to Kat that both valued the return to purposeful action after their captivity needed to reestablish their agency through even simple tasks. As the sun rose fully, Campbell conferred with Martinez, who had been monitoring their back trail for signs of pursuit. The tracker's report was cautiously optimistic, no immediate evidence of followers, suggesting either that Wade had lost their trail in the night or had chosen to prioritize his escape over recovering his prisoners. We'll rest here until midday, Campbell decided. The prisoners need recovery time, and pushing forward in daylight increases our visibility. Resume travel and afternoon reach Fort Ellis by tomorrow morning if pace allows. With immediate danger apparently reduced, the rescue party settled into watchful rest. Thompson attended more thoroughly to Swift Eagle's injuries, which proved less severe than initially feared, painful, but not life-threatening, the result of resistance during captivity rather than systematic torture. Kat remained close to Swift Eagle throughout this treatment, her presence seemingly providing comfort despite her inability to speak. When Thompson finished and moved to check on Morningstar, Swift Eagle beckoned Kat closer, his expression serious beneath the stoic acceptance of pain. "Wade knows you survived," he said without preamble. "Questioned me about Ghost Child, who played flute on Mountain. Believes you have evidence that could destroy him in Blackwood." Kat nodded, confirming this assessment with a quick note on her slate, evidence delivered to Fort Ellis. "Judge Wilson preparing case." "Good." Swift Eagle's expression lightened slightly. "Justice may yet come for both our peoples." He paused, studying her face with the penetrating attention that had characterized their relationship from the beginning, seeing beyond surface to essence. "But what comes for you, Catherine Sullivan? What path opens now?" The question struck to the heart of uncertainties. Kat had been avoiding the looming decisions about her future once the immediate crisis passed. On her slate, she wrote honestly, "Don't know. Fort people want me to be child again. Go back to old life." Swift Eagle considered her words thoughtfully. "Can you, after all that has happened, all you have become?" Kat shook her head, grateful for his understanding of the fundamental transformation she had undergone. She wrote, "Not same person anymore. Can't pretend to be." "No," Swift Eagle agreed. "The river does not flow backward. You have walked between worlds, white settlement and wilderness, speech and silence, child and warrior. That journey changes forever." He shifted position, wincing slightly at the movement before continuing. "Among my people, such boundary crossers are valued. They stand at the edge of the circle, seeing both inside and outside. They translate between worlds that do not understand each other." This perspective offered a new framework for considering her uncertain future, not as a binary choice between returning to civilization or remaining in the wilderness, but as potentially creating a new position that drew from both experiences. Kat wrote, "Could I stay with your people?" Swift Eagle's expression softened. "My lodge would welcome you, little ghost. But think carefully. The Cheyenne face difficult times ahead. Government pushes us onto smaller lands away from the traditional hunting grounds. Life you would find with us is not easy one." His honesty, neither encouraging false hopes nor rejecting the possibility, outright reinforced Kat's trust in his guidance. He offered neither simple solutions nor sentimental promises, but respected her enough to present reality without embellishment. Before she could respond further, Campbell approached his manor, suggesting new developments. "Rider approaching from the east," he reported. "Single horseman moving openly rather than attempting concealment. Not Wade's men." Swift Eagle and Kat exchanged glances, both immediately alert to potential new threats or opportunities. Campbell gestured for everyone to maintain their positions, while he and Martinez investigated the approaching rider. They returned shortly with unexpected news. "Military courier from Fort Ellis," Campbell explained, "dispatched to locate our party with urgent information." The courier, a young soldier who had ridden through the night, delivered his message directly. "Commander Harding sends word Colonel Blackwood has arrived at the fort with a full company. He's demanding custody of all documents and witnesses related to the Wade investigation, citing military authority over matters affecting territorial security." Campbell's expression darkened. "Blackwood's trying to take control of the evidence before Judge Wilson can establish federal jurisdiction. Worse," the courier continued, "he's issued orders for Swift Eagle's arrest as a hostile agent responsible for attacks on settlements. Claims to have witnesses who'll testify he led raids disguised as a white man." The audacity of this reversal, accusing Swift Eagle of precisely the deception Wade had practiced, left even Campbell momentarily speechless with outrage. Swift Eagle himself received the news with grim stoicism, as if he had expected nothing better from Blackwood. "There's more," the courier added. "Judge Wilson anticipated this move. He's requesting you divert your party to Helena rather than returning to Fort Ellis. Federal marshals are en route there to secure testimony and evidence before Blackwood can suppress it. This development forced an immediate recalculation of their plans. Campbell conferred briefly with his men before announcing his decision. We'll split the party. Martinez, Reynolds, and I will escort Swift Eagle, Morningstar, and Miss Sullivan to Helena as requested. Jackson and Thompson will return to Fort Ellis with the courier reporting our success, but claiming the prisoners and Miss Sullivan remain behind due to injuries, buying us time to reach federal authorities. It was a sound strategy, maximizing the chances that at least some of their group would reach Helena with the crucial witnesses. The men accepted their assignments without complaint, recognizing the importance of their mission transcended personal preferences. As they prepared for this adjusted journey, Swift Eagle spoke quietly to Kat. Helena means white man's justice. Courts, lawyers' testimony. He studied her face with gentle concern. Are you ready to speak your truth before such people? Not with flute or slate, but with voice if it returns. The question touched the core of Kat's fears, not just the physical inability to speak that had claimed her since the massacre, but the deeper challenge of re-entering human society, of translating her experiences into terms others could comprehend. She wrote with uncharacteristic hesitation, "What if voice never returns? Then truth finds another way," Swift Eagle replied simply, "as it already has through your courage, your memory, your music." He touched the bone whistle she still wore. Some songs need no words to be understood. The quiet confidence in his assessment, neither dismissing her muteness as temporary, nor treating it as defining limitation, provided unexpected comfort. Swift Eagle had always seen her capabilities rather than her constraints, had valued what she could do rather than focusing on what she could not. With renewed determination, Kat wrote firmly, "Will tell truth however I can, for my family, for yours, for justice." Swift Eagle nodded, a hint of pride warming his stoic features. "Then we continue this journey together, little ghost, not as teacher and student now, but as allies who have each saved the other." This subtle redefinition of their relationship acknowledged Kat's growth and contribution, no longer simply the rescued child, but a partner in their shared quest for justice. The recognition carried profound meaning, affirming her transformation from victim to agent of her own destiny. As they prepared to depart for Helena, dividing supplies and confirming routes, Kat found herself standing momentarily apart, gazing eastward toward Fort Ellis, and beyond it to the settled lands that had once been her home. Then westward toward the mountains, where she had found both isolation and connection, suffering and strength. Two worlds neither fully hers any longer. Yet perhaps, as Swift Eagle suggested, her place was not within either circle, but at the boundary between them, translating, connecting, helping each understand the other in ways only someone who had walked both paths could achieve. It was not the future she would have chosen before the massacre, not the life her parents had envisioned for their musical daughter. But it was a purpose that honored both her Boston upbringing and her wilderness transformation, that valued rather than rejected the complex person she had become through tragedy and survival. As Campbell gave the order to move out, Kat took her place beside Swift Eagle and Morningstar, ready to continue a journey that had begun 6 months earlier, beneath a fallen pine, a journey no longer defined by flight from horror, but by movement toward justice, no longer marked by silence as loss, but by new forms of communication that transcended ordinary speech. Whatever awaited in Helena, whether courts and testimony or further challenges unforeseen, she would face it not as the child who had hidden from killers, nor as the ghost who had haunted the mountainside, but as Catherine Sullivan in her entirety, daughter of Boston's survivor of wilderness, student of Cheyenne wisdom, player of two musical traditions, boundary crosser, truth bearer, voice of the wilderness, speaking in whatever language justice required. Helena rose before them as evening approached on the second day of their journey, a frontier capital that straddled the line between civilization and wilderness, its buildings simultaneously imposing and tenuous against the backdrop of surrounding mountains. As Campbell led their small party through the outskirts, Kat observed the curious mixture of frontier rawness and eastern pretension that characterized the territorial seat of government saloons and stables, standing alongside governmental offices and imposing homes that would not have looked out of place in Boston. They proceeded directly to a residence on the city's western edge, a substantial house set back from the road with extensive grounds that provided both privacy and defensive advantages. Judge Wilson himself met them at the door, relief evident in his expression as he ushered them quickly inside. "Thank God you've made it," he greeted Campbell. "Blackwood's men have been watching the main roads into town since yesterday. We feared interception." The interior of Wilson's home revealed preparations for their arrival, a front parlor converted to temporary infirmary for Swift Eagle and Morningstar, additional security in the form of 2 federal marshals stationed discreetly near entrances, and Elizabeth Wilson organizing practical necessities with quiet efficiency. As Campbell reported their journey's events, Judge Wilson listened with grave attention, his expression darkening at the news of Blackwood's attempt to seize control of the investigation. When the captain finished, Wilson outlined the rapidly evolving situation. "Blackwood has overplayed his hand," the judge explained. "His heavy-handed actions at Fort Ellis, demanding documents under military authority, threatening Commander Harding with court-martial for insubordination, alerted federal authorities that something significant was being suppressed." He gestured toward a telegram lying on his desk. "I've received confirmation that the U.S. Attorney General has appointed a special investigator who arrives tomorrow. With sworn testimony from you," he indicated Swift Eagle, Morningstar, and Cat, "combined with the documentary evidence already secured, we can prevent Blackwood from burying this conspiracy." It was encouraging news, suggesting the wheels of justice had begun turning in their favor. Yet Swift Eagle received this information with measured caution rather than celebration. "Many promises have been made to my people before," he observed quietly. "Many investigations begun. Few bring justice in the end." Wilson acknowledged this reality with surprising candor. "You have reason for skepticism, sir. The history between your people and our government is replete with broken promises and selective justice." He met Swift Eagle's gaze directly. "But I give you my personal word, this time will be different. The evidence is too compelling, the crimes too severe to be dismissed through the usual channels." Whether Swift Eagle found this assurance convincing remained unclear, but he accepted it with a dignified nod. "Then we will speak our truth. The spirits will determine what grows from those seeds." With immediate safety secured, the practical needs of the rescued prisoners took precedence. Dr. Matthews, a physician allied with Wilson, arrived to properly treat Swift Eagle and Morningstar's injuries, while Elizabeth organized meals and fresh clothing for everyone. Kat found herself shepherded to a comfortable guest room, complete with bath and clean garments, sized approximately for her small frame. The civilized comforts, hot water, soft bed, carefully prepared food created a strange disconnection after months of wilderness existence and days of tense travel. Kat moved through these surroundings like a visitor from another world, appreciating their practical benefits, while feeling oddly detached from their implied normality. That evening, as the household settled into watchful quiet, Elizabeth Wilson sought Kat out in her assigned room, bearing a small tray with tea and biscuits. "I thought you might want something before sleep," she offered. "The day has been long." Kat accepted the kindness with a nod of thanks, gesturing for Elizabeth to stay if she wished. The young woman settled into a chair near the window, studying Kat with thoughtful interest rather than the clinical assessment or pitying concern others often displayed. "Father says you'll need to give testimony tomorrow," Elizabeth observed, "about what you witnessed during the massacre and afterward. Are you prepared for that?" Kat considered the question carefully before writing on her slate, "as ready as possible. Truth is clear in my mind. I